911.
Ma'am, I killed my boyfriend in self-defense.
Okay, where are you at?
I'm at 12 Meadow Lane, Highland Heights, Kentucky. Ma'am, I killed him in self-defense.
Okay. Hold on. What did you kill him with?
A gun, a loaded gun in the house.
Where are you?
I'm standing about 10 feet from his dead body.
Okay, are you sure that he is dead?
He's dead, ma'am. He's completely dead.
Okay, what's your name?
My name is Shana Michelle Huber. I can hear myself echoing in the background, ma'am.
It's just the phone system. The phone system has got a delay.
Are they going to arrest me?
Ma'am, I don't know what they'll do. We're going to send them out.
I mean, I'm not a murderer, ma'am. I just killed him.
What happened exactly? What happened?
He beat me and tried to carry me out of the house, and I came back in to get my things, and he was right in front of me, and he reached down and grabbed the gun, and I grabbed it out of his hand and pulled the trigger, and I killed him.
Okay, have you had a history of domestic violence with him?
Yes. I was just very frightened. He's a lot bigger than me. And because he was twitching and I knew he was going to die anyway, and he was making funny noises, I shot him a couple more times just to kill him. Because I knew he would have been.
I'm sorry, you said you shot him a couple more times after that?
Yeah.
How many times did you shoot him total?
I don't know. Enough to make sure he was dead. Because he was twitching so bad, I didn't want to watch him lay there and twitch.
So you shot him instead of calling 911?
Yeah, I did, because I knew he was going to die anyway.
Hubers has called 911 to report her deceased boyfriend and that she has killed him. But what she's also offering the dispatcher is a level of detail about how she killed him and a distancing from any aspect of him that's human. She's referring to him as a dead body. She's automatically telling the dispatcher she did this in self-defense. And that's a little unusual. The majority of people would make the decision to get help if somebody was shot accidentally. Your first thought is not to finish the job.
You want something to drink? Want some water? Okay, yeah, I need you some water. Go ahead and sit down. You're fine. All right? You're fine. I'll shut this. I'll give you some water. I'll be within just a second. You're fine.
It's very unusual that she whimpers, seems distraught for the first couple of seconds, but then almost like she switches off and it's a completely different person. She changes her demeanor as soon as the detective leaves the room. That would not be typical of someone who just killed her boyfriend and who's completely overwhelmed at having done such a horrific thing.
I have to read you what's called your rights, okay? Your Miranda rights. It protects you, it protects me, okay?
Yeah. I really want to have an attorney present.
Okay, do you have an attorney?
My parents could get me one.
Okay, what was his name?
The man that I killed, Ryan Carter Poston. What am I doing tonight? Am I getting to go home?
I haven't had the foggiest at this point. I've just still got to talk to a couple other people, okay?
I honestly, shot the man in self-defense.
Well, that's the kind of questions I was going to ask. When you make the statements, that's fine, but I can't ask you any questions because you wanted an attorney.
Well, if I if I waive my right to just speak and not have an attorney today, could that prevent me from going to jail tonight?
I can't promise you anything, okay?
Psychopaths, because of their lack of empathy, essentially they're at the center of their universe. Everyone else around is for their pleasure or should be eliminated because they're some kind of roadblock to what they want to get. And what we see here is already evidence of that. I think she's fully aware that she's killed somebody. She thinks she's smarter. She thinks she should get away with it. She should not be held accountable. I should be able to walk out tonight and be done. Isn't that right? And when it turns out not to be true, that's when things start to unravel.
I really love him. And it's just really messed up that we had to get into a physical fight and then this had to happen, you know. And if I could go back and do all over again, I would rather have my head beat into the coffee table. I know that sounds so bad, but he was so abusive to me that all those feelings are like, it's like, I feel really bad about it because I really loved him. But he was so abusive to me today and in the recent past that it's like, I feel like that's evil of me in my heart.
It's important to realize that she's already asked for a lawyer, and yet Hubers can't seem to stop talking. Her need to manage impressions and to push forward her narrative is really what's taken over.
Hubers felt relief because she had enough. And that's very consistent with the psychopath. Good psychopaths learn how to mimic genuine human emotion, attraction, compassion, love, anger, resentment. And what we're seeing here is her attempt to do that.
I remember more details and more of the nasty things he said, and him shutting me in the door, shutting my arm in the door, even at the floor, and taking me out and throwing me into the bookshelf. That's when he started screaming all the nasty things at me. You're a hillbilly. Everyone knows you're crazy. I remember now that he threw me into the TV, the big screen.
She's setting up the story now in even more detail, saying, I'm remembering things. Whether it's her arm shutting the door, whether she's thrown against the bookshelf, whether she's smashed her head into the TV set. But at the scene, the bookshelf is undisturbed. Things are still in immaculate order on the shelf. There's no crack in the screen. She doesn't have any bruises, doesn't have any marks on her. So what she's saying doesn't match the physical reality.
He put his arm across the table and had it in my face and was screaming at me at the top of his lungs. Hillbilly. I hate you. I hate your Eastern Kentucky accent. I hate your mother. I hate you. I hate everything about you for what you are. I remember screaming, reaching up to grab his shirt. You mocked my family, my mother, and my family.
And what's interesting in this segment of the interrogation is she really moves away from any physical abuse and essentially describes a motive for killing him. He was insulting her and her family. How dare he? Odd to say, but psychopaths are usually very sensitive people too. In many cases, their behavior, their demeanor is born out of a self-esteem which is very fragile, which is very sensitive to a perceived insult. And what happens once the psychopath feels insulted in any way is a catastrophic reaction of rage.
And he wasn't completely standing up. He was like this. He was sitting, he was enough that when I shot him, he was like this. Literally. That's when I knew he was dead. Or close to it. And I couldn't, I let him, I still, even though it hurt, I still loved him. But I couldn't stand to watch him twitch. I walked around the table. And I think that's when I shot him in the head. I knew he was going to die or have a completely deformed face. He's very vain. One of our last conversations we had that was good was that he wants to get a nose job. Just that kind of person. And I shot him right here. I gave him his nose job. He wanted.
She wasn't going to give him up to anybody else. But she shot him in the face. That's a very personalized way of killing someone. She could have shot him in the chest or the heart. That might be sentimental, but she shot him in the face. And she was angry, and she was going to pay him back. And I think shooting him in the face was deliberate. Yeah, I don't think it was an accident.
I shot him probably 6 times. Shot him in the head. He fell onto the ground. He was like laying like this. He was twitching some more. I shot him a couple more times just to make sure he was dead. Because I didn't want to watch him die. I don't know if anyone will ever want to marry me. They know that I killed a boyfriend and self-defense. Not funny, but he wasn't a good person. And I know that I'm the one that's here and he's not. But the caliber of person that I am is like supersedes him on so many levels. And everyone knows it. I don't blame myself, though. I blame the way that he treated me today. The only good thing is that he can't mistreat me anymore. Even if I suffer dearly for it, I can't be hurt anymore. That feels really good. You know?
That line, I wonder if anyone will want to marry me. It's not the usual line people have when they're being detained after having shot someone. So from a psychological standpoint, we have to take it as a significant indicator of what's seriously important to her. I'd really want to know how long this has been an obsession. If Ryan was saying, no, I'm not marrying you, I'm moving on to other people, he's thwarting that fantasy. And now that he's gone, she's wondering, well, I wonder if there'll be another prospect, which means that the idea of being married is much more important than who she's going to marry.
I'm gonna. Okay, thanks. Yep. Is there a death penalty in Kentucky?
Mm-hmm.
What are they gonna do with me?
I don't know. They just told me to come here and sit with you. Did you have enough drink?
Were you one of the officers at the scene? See, I walked a lot. I don't really remember. Did you go in and look at his body?
Not yet.
Is it still laying there?
I don't know, ma'am. They just told me to come and sit. I'm just here to sit with you, ma'am. You're talking to the wrong person. Okay?
Should I have let him hurt me? Should I have taken a chance? Can I talk to Amber?
She's coming back in a little bit. Yeah.
The narcissism that Hubers struggles with is really seen here because she doesn't have an audience. It's difficult to engage in impression management if nobody's paying attention to you. And essentially, this officer's not paying attention to Hubers. And what she does is she doesn't tolerate it. She pretty rapidly asks to have Amber brought back in. And Amber is this female officer who somehow Hubers has fused with and believes might be her best shot at convincing them that this was self-defense.
Help. I did. Yes, I did. I can't believe I did that. Kill him. Kill him. She murdered her.
Who sings to themselves after they've killed somebody? This is like she's finally grabbed the brass ring. She's almost surprised at herself that she was able to succeed. She refers to herself in the third person. We all have parts in ourselves, right? The part that is wife or husband or father or daughter or is all a little bit different. Sometimes psychopaths don't integrate these parts so well. So in order to get through their daily life, they have to split apart parts of themselves and sort of put them in a box and only let them out when the opportune time arises. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is her saying to herself, I'm a killer.
I don't even know what to do right now. I can only imagine what's going through these people's heads. You just can't you can't treat somebody like that. You can't push somebody around the room. You can't throw somebody into the ground. I probably have rug burns. I was thinking about that. Okay. I probably have rug burns. I don't know if I can find any. I did have my clothes on. I don't have any marks, but I was thrown around the room. I probably do on my legs, actually. I was thinking about that. I probably do have some bruises. How about that? My shoulder hurt. I think he grabbed me by the shoulder. I'm a bit panicked now. I'm even alive to remember.
As time has gone on and Hubers is sitting in this room waiting to be released, what's likely happening is she's playing back things that she has said to the dispatcher and to the case agent about how things happened. And she's starting to realize the crime scene might not look like that. My body doesn't look like that, like there was a struggle. She starts to play back things she said and tries to plug in holes and gaps. And when Hubers says he isn't alive to remember, what she might be telling us is he's not alive to testify against me.
I am really not a bad person. I think anybody who knows me knows that. I mean, look at me. I'm motivated, I'm educated, I love people. My degree is in counseling psychology. I want to help people. There's something like this is what I did with you at wrong.
A woman is behind bars tonight. Shayna Hubers is charged with the murder of her boyfriend. Highland Heights police responded to the report of a person shot at 12 Meadow Lane last night around 9. That's when they found the victim, Ryan Poston. The 29-year-old had been shot and killed. Still, no word on a possible motive.
I wanted to kill myself. But that's not gonna help anything. You know? I'd rather be alive. I'd rather be alive. And I'd rather be alive and incarcerated. My grandma always told me you commit suicide. Do you believe in God? I hate him so strongly for the way that he spoke to me, for the things that he was doing. Can I call my mother? I'll go ask him. Okay, could you ask that for me? Hold on just a second.
We can see her start to play every card she can with this female law enforcement agent. So she invokes a God, She invokes the mother card. She starts to pull at all of the possible heartstrings, in her mind thinking, this is happening, this is working, I'm effective. And as soon as the officer leaves the room, she compliments herself on what a phenomenal acting job she's just done. And that's truly remarkable, truly cold-blooded.
I feel bad for his family. I feel bad for his sisters, I know a lot of them. I genuinely feel terrible for the family. I feel awful. I don't think I should ever have to talk to them about it, though. I don't think that I should ever have to say anything to them. I don't think I owe anybody that. Who cares for him? Love can turn to hate so quick.
When she says love can turn to hate real quick, I believe she's being absolutely correct, that she could be really loving in one moment, and once she finally heard no, that she becomes enraged and hates intensely. We know that people with psychopathy don't regulate the emotions in the same way that healthy people do. As we mature in life, we gain in that ability to modulate our emotions. And in psychopathy, that's a feature that doesn't really develop. They flip from one state immediately to the other.
I just feel like more emotions than I've ever felt at one time. Have you ever had something happen to you where you felt all these emotions at once? You don't even know which one to pick out of the jar. Part of me, there's a part of me that's very proud. I think that I hate men enough now, after I've been abused, that I think I can be okay, being me. And if I get out, if I don't get any serious consequences, then I could really be happy just having a career and maybe not even ever getting married. Because this is very traumatic. It's very traumatic for me to live with it.
Huber's confusion around her emotions and not knowing which ones to pick out of a jar may be a little window into the fact that she has enough awareness to know that she doesn't experience emotions the way the rest of us do. And what she's really telling us is that she's having a hard time figuring out which emotions she's supposed to mimic.
So she's now developing the story about she has maybe PTSD. So she's kind of a heroic survivor of all the abuse. She is acting. This is a performance for her. She doesn't really care about the fact that Ryan is dead. So there's no genuine grief. And she approves of herself really highly. And she's given herself a pat on the back. She's kind of quite proud of herself.
Here's what's going to happen right now, Shayna. Okay, with everything that we have, I'm going to have to charge you with murder. Okay, right now. And
right now?
Yeah. Well, we got until you go to court and stuff, and then you decide what they're going to do with it. Okay. But what we're going to do is we'll do a search warrant.
What degree?
Murder. There's no degree.
She would not let the relationship end. He was trying to end the relationship many times, and he was a little too nice about it because he never really wanted to hurt her feelings. He said to me, "This is getting to be restraining order level crazy. I'm not kidding. You need to talk to her." She sent me 75 texts in the last hour.
On the stand, lead investigator Bill Birkenhauer painted Shayna Hubers as a jilted girlfriend who could not let go. Birkenhauer retrieved about 20 to 30,000 pages of information from Shayna Hubers and Ryan Poston's phone in the last 8 months before his death. The data detailed an on-again, off-again relationship with Hubers, sending 50 messages for every one that Poston returned.
What does she say to her friend right after she calls Ryan Poston an evil person?
She says when she goes to the shooting range with Ryan tonight, she wants to turn around, shoot and kill him and play like it's an accident.
It becomes pretty clear at trial through the testimony of multiple witnesses that her story, her description of the events, of the quality and nature of their relationship had actually nothing to do with reality. In fact, this was a situation where she wanted to pursue a relationship, he did not. And she, like a psychopath would, had the thought, well, if I can't have him, nobody will. And how dare he not want me?
At Huber's trial, what starts to emerge is a pattern of behavior where Hubers wasn't respecting Ryan's boundaries. Hubers was bombarding him with text messages, somewhere along the lines of 50 messages to every one of his own. She was engaging in behavior that if the genders, I think, were reversed, and it was a male engaging in this behavior with a female, we would be much faster as society to label that as stalking, as harassment. But because she is this damsel in distress, young female who is soft-spoken and she's pretty, nobody really labeled it that way until we had a dead person.
I told him to make sure that he was kind to Shayna and that he told her honestly what was going on so that she didn't find out later that he was out with someone else.
That someone was Audrey Bolte, Miss Ohio 2012.
When Hubers found out that he was going to go out on a date with a former beauty queen, that became the straw that broke the camel's back. That was a point she could not let happen. Because once he did that, that meant that their relationship was over. Huber's fragile ego could not tolerate that, and she then went into action. Because as far as she's concerned, he's an object and he belongs to her.
Did she ever at times laugh about certain parts of the incident that happened on October 12th of 2012?
Yes.
Which parts did she laugh about?
Thing about shooting him in the face and giving him the nose job he always wanted. She said she was going to plead insanity, but then she said that she was too smart because she has an IQ of Einstein, up to the IQ of Einstein, and so she's going to plead the white battered syndrome.
A local breaking news alert now. Shayna Hubers has been found guilty of murder.
Convicted killer Shayna Hubers won't be sentenced until June, but right now her lawyers are trying to get her a shorter prison sentence. They are asking the judge to declare Hubers a domestic violence victim, saying she was abused during her relationship with Ryan Poston. Now, if the judge rules in her favor, she could be eligible for parole in just 5.5 years.
Now that Hubers has been convicted, her legal team is trying to get the court to acknowledge that she be handled as a special victim or a special circumstance, that she was in fact the victim of domestic violence, and that this is a battered women's syndrome case or a battered victims case.
She needs to represent herself as having been in a long-standing relationship that was stable, they were together, they're living together, and that she is the victim of a history of abuse over time. The challenge for her will be, it's going to have to match evidence.
What did you tell the police officer when he asked you specifically, is that your residence?
I don't live with him.
If you would flip that over, is that list of 10 guys on that page?
Sure, I may have slept with 10 guys in 2012, but I don't see how that's relevant to any of this.
Well, luckily that's not up to you.
Keep the civil tongue in your head, number one. And just answer the questions, all right?
When they start looking at the facts, it turns out they're not living together. It's not her house. They're not in a monogamous relationship. He's dating other people. She's been seeing other men. He's been saying, it's over, move on. And she's been refusing to accept that.
What I think happened in that apartment was little more than cold-blooded murder. It's probably as cold-blooded an act as I've been associated with in the criminal justice system in the 30-plus years I've been in it.
Good evening, everyone. A young woman convicted of killing her on and off again boyfriend will get a new shot at freedom.
And it's all because one juror didn't pay child support more than 2 decades ago.
Kentucky law says you cannot serve on a jury if you are a convicted felon.
Okay, so here we are. Thanks again for making time for us. So, the big question, it appears that you've fallen in love.
Yes. If you would have asked me 5, 6 years ago, am I straight, am I bisexual, am I lesbian, I would have said I'm a, heterosexual woman. But things happen in your life, and what I feel for Unique is real, and I don't have a doubt about that in my mind. And that's all we're doing here is exercising our First Amendment right to become married.
I have the affidavit that shows May 2nd as your request to get a marriage license. Have you heard back from anyone yet?
We have not. And in my opinion, I feel like we're being spun already. And I feel as if I've already been retaliated against. So.
Even if it's only been 7 days?
Yes. I feel as if our constitutional First Amendment right to marry, because Unique is biologically a male and I'm a woman, are being violated and we're being retaliated against due to my high-profile case and, my name in Cincinnati.
Some may say because this is more of either a publicity stunt or something to derail your second trial.
This is no stunt. We actually genuinely love each other. I love Richie, Unique, Richard, Devon McVie, Junior. And to me, it's nothing but real. It's nothing but genuine love that we feel for one another. And he would tell you the same. I have a deeper connection with him than I've ever had with anyone in my life, of the opposite sex or same sex. That doesn't matter to me. And this is no kind of joke.
Huber's belief that 7 days of waiting to hear from the Department of Corrections if her marriage will be approved is somehow them retaliating against her just speaks to that sense of entitlement that the rules don't apply to her. Huber's is trying to get the audience to believe that she has this deep love for Unique Taylor, who happens to be transgendered. She still refers to her partner as he. Huber's is not even using the correct pronoun about her partner who she wants to marry. And so the fact that Huber's continues to maintain that it doesn't matter to her indicates to us she really hasn't changed.
How are you different than October 2012?
I think I've grown up a lot. I think I've been through a lot. And I think I was a young girl then, and I think I'm a woman now.
You taking the stand then during this trial?
I'll leave that up to, I'll make that a surprise. We'll put that into surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Okay.
When Huber's is asked by the journalist whether she intends to testify in this retrial, what she says is, we'll make it a surprise. So she has kind of this glib, lighthearted attitude about what is about to be a murder trial. And she kind of handles this like a press conference and like she's celebrity status and everyone wants to know. And so she's gonna leave it as a cliffhanger for the viewers. Nowhere in this interview that Hubers has with the media does she show any signs of remorse, nor does she show any consideration for how Ryan's family is going to be re-traumatized and re-victimized, having to sit through this trial all over again.
A big surprise in court today as the woman accused of murdering her former boyfriend takes the stand to tell her side of the story today.
I played in the marching band. I played the flute and the piccolo in the band. And I was a good student. And I was made fun of and called a nerd. And my parents were very strict, and they made me wear more modest clothes than the other children that weren't necessarily stylish. And I was picked on a lot as a child.
Without being too personal, I'm worried that y'all have sexual relations.
Yes, sir.
Was there any issue that was raised as it relates to that sexual interaction?
The issue that I was unable to orgasm during sex. Ryan always put pressure on me to orgasm. He put pressure on me to get breast implants, and he also put pressure on me to remain a certain size or lose weight.
Huber's decision to testify at her retrial when she did not testify at the merits phase of her initial trial speaks to her narcissism. I have a hard time believing her attorneys advised her to get on the stand.
And I think it's important to say here, too, that her history of being abused or bullied at school, if it's true, is not a pathway towards psychopathy. A lot of people, unfortunately, are abused and are the victims of bullying. It doesn't turn them into criminals. So in her mind, she thinks that she can blame these individuals, fellow students, parents, other people in the community, on what she did, when in fact, it's all her.
You testified yesterday, I think the words you said, correct me if I'm wrong, ma'am, that Mr. Poston was callous when you told him about your past?
My perception was that he was insensitive about it.
You asked Mr. Poston the question after you told him what happened, if he thought any less of you.
Yes.
And what was his response to you?
He said he wouldn't.
And in fact, he said that would be deranged for anyone to think less of you.
Yes, he used the word deranged.
There wasn't any data at all that said that he was an explosive, violent, impulsive person. But there was plenty of evidence that Prince testified about that she could be manipulative. And I think even at the gun range, she joked about, like, killing him. So that wasn't going to work well for her at the trial, given her defense.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Shayna Hubers, guilty of murder. We, the jury, fix the
January 29, 2017. Quebec City was frozen beneath a hard Canadian winter. Snowbanks stood like walls along the sidewalks, packed high from weeks of storms. Streetlights glowed through drifting flakes, casting pale orange halos over empty roads. The cold had a way of swallowing sound in that part of the city. Even passing cars seemed quieter under the weight of snow and ice. It was the kind of night where people hurried indoors, where windows fogged from heaters running too long, where families gathered around dinner tables and forgot about the bitterness waiting outside. Inside the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, warmth settled into every corner of the mosque. Boots lined the entrance in uneven rows. Jackets hung heavy with melted snow. The smell of wool, coffee, and winter air mixed softly together beneath fluorescent lights. Men greeted one another in low voices. Some had just finished long work shifts. Others had arrived carrying children asleep on their shoulders. A few stood near the back discussing politics, soccer, and weather while waiting for evening prayer to begin. Nothing about the building suggested danger. It sat quietly in St. Foy like it always had. Ordinary. Peaceful. The kind of place most people passed without noticing. But on that night, hidden beneath layers of silence and snow, something else was moving through the city. A black car rolled slowly through the streets. Its headlights cut across icy intersections. Tires hissed over slush. Inside the vehicle sat a 27-year-old university student named Alexandre Bissonnette. His face looked calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes after a terrible decision has already been made. Beside him rested a firearm. Another weapon waited nearby. The heater inside the car hummed softly while outside, the temperature dropped lower and lower. At 7:55 p.m., worshippers inside the mosque bowed their heads toward the floor. Some prayed for family overseas. Some prayed for better work. Some prayed for peace in countries they had escaped years earlier. Most of them had no idea their final moments had already begun. The front door opened. At first, nobody reacted. People came and went all the time during prayer. The sound of boots against the floor barely registered above the soft rhythm of recitation echoing through the room. But then came another sound. Sharp. Metallic. Violent. The first gunshot cracked through the mosque like an explosion. For a split second, confusion froze the room. A few men lifted their heads. Others turned instinctively toward the entrance. Human beings are not built to immediately understand horror. The brain resists it. It searches for simpler explanations first. A dropped object. Construction noise. Fireworks. Then came another shot. And another. And another. The silence shattered completely. Panic erupted instantly. Men screamed. Bodies dove toward the floor. Some tried to crawl between rows of worshippers. Others rushed toward exits that suddenly felt impossibly far away. The gunfire continued relentlessly, deafening inside the enclosed prayer hall. Bullets slammed into walls, windows, flesh. Echoes ricocheted in every direction until nobody could tell where safety was anymore. One survivor would later remember hearing people cry out for their mothers. Another remembered seeing shoes scattered across the carpet as people ran barefoot through blood. A father threw himself in front of others. A man near the entrance attempted to stop the shooter before collapsing onto the floor. In less than 2 minutes, 6 men were dead. 19 more were wounded. And an entire country was about to wake up to a nightmare it never believed could happen there. Canada liked to imagine itself differently from the rest of the world. Safer. Kinder. Immune to the kind of hatred that produced massacres. Quebec City especially carried an image of quiet stability. Historic streets. Snow-covered churches. Families skating beneath winter skies. Violence like this belonged somewhere else. Somewhere far away on television screens. But hatred does not recognize borders. It grows quietly. Sometimes behind computer screens glowing late at night. Sometimes inside lonely bedrooms. Sometimes inside the mind of a person who smiles politely in public while feeding darker thoughts in private. By the time police dispatchers began receiving frantic emergency calls, the shooter had already fled the mosque. Witnesses screamed into phones. Their words stumbled over each other through terror and shock. Gunshots. Dead bodies. Blood everywhere. Ambulances were dispatched immediately. Patrol cars raced through icy streets with lights flashing across the snow. Inside the mosque, survivors hid behind pillars and overturned furniture. Some played dead. Others whispered prayers beneath shaking breaths. Cell phones rang unanswered beside bodies lying motionless on the carpet. A wounded man dragged himself toward another victim despite blood pouring from his leg. One survivor held pressure against a friend's wound while begging him not to close his eyes. The prayer hall looked unrecognizable now. Winter boots abandoned near the entrance. Broken glass glittering beneath fluorescent light. Bullet holes carved into walls that hours earlier had heard only prayer. And everywhere blood. Outside, snow continued falling quietly. Emergency vehicles flooded the area within minutes. Red and blue lights painted the mosque and surrounding houses in frantic colors. Officers stormed the building expecting an active shooter situation. Paramedics followed behind carrying stretchers into scenes many of them would later struggle to forget. Some victims were still breathing. Others were beyond saving. One officer reportedly removed his gloves in the freezing cold because his hands shook too badly to work properly. Another survivor wandered outside without shoes, covered in blood that steamed faintly in the winter air. Neighbors stood behind police tape watching in disbelief. Nobody fully understood what had happened yet. Rumors spread rapidly through phones and social media. A terrorist attack. Multiple shooters. Hostages. Nobody knew what was true. But everyone understood one thing immediately. Something monstrous had entered Quebec City. Roughly 20 minutes after the shooting, police received another unexpected call. The caller identified himself as the gunman. His voice sounded controlled, almost detached. He provided information about his vehicle and location. Officers tracked him down on a nearby bridge. When police surrounded the car, Alexandre Bissonnette surrendered without resistance. No dramatic chase. No final confrontation. Just a young man stepping out into the freezing night while emergency lights reflected off snow around him. Hours later, investigators would search through his online activity. They would uncover digital trails leading into political extremism, anti-immigration rhetoric, and obsessive consumption of far-right content. They would learn about his isolation, his anger, his fascination with mass shootings, his growing resentment toward Muslims and refugees. But none of that mattered yet inside the mosque. Because fathers were still dying there. Friends were still calling names that would never answer back. And survivors sat trembling against walls trying to understand how an evening prayer had turned into a battlefield. The names of the dead slowly emerged through the night. Azedine Soufiane, Mamadou Tanu Barry, Khaled Belkacemi, Abdelkrim Hussein, Ibrahima Barry, Abubakar Thapti. Men with families. Men with careers. Men who had crossed oceans searching for safety and opportunity in Canada. Some were professors. Some worked in government. Some spent weekends coaching children or helping newcomers settle into their communities. They were not symbols. They were human beings whose lives ended on the carpet of a mosque while praying. And outside that building, another story was beginning to unfold. Because the massacre at the Quebec City Mosque was not simply about one gunman. It was about fear. About radicalization. About what happens when hatred is repeated often enough that it begins to sound normal. In the years before the attack, political tensions surrounding immigration and Islam had intensified across Europe and North America. Terrorist attacks overseas dominated headlines. Online forums filled with conspiracy theories warning about refugees and Muslims replacing Western culture. Politicians built careers around anger. Algorithms rewarded outrage. Every click pulled vulnerable minds deeper into echo chambers where fear transformed into resentment, and resentment slowly transformed into dehumanization. Alexandre Bissonnette did not invent hatred that night. He absorbed it. Fed on it. Allowed it to grow inside him until 6 innocent people became targets instead of human beings. And perhaps the most terrifying part of all was how ordinary he appeared beforehand. He was not some shadowy criminal living outside society. He studied political science. He attended university classes. He played video games. He argued online. People who knew him described him as shy, awkward, anxious. But hidden beneath that fragile exterior was something darker taking shape quietly over time. The attack would send shockwaves across Canada and far beyond it. Vigils filled city streets. Thousands gathered holding candles beneath snowfall. Political leaders condemned the massacre. Muslim communities across the country increased security, fearing copycat attacks. Parents questioned whether their children were truly safe attending prayer. Survivors carried trauma that would follow them for years. Some would never again feel comfortable standing near mosque entrances. Some panicked at loud noises. Some replayed the gunfire every night before sleep. And still, beneath all the grief, another uncomfortable question lingered. How had this happened here? How could a country known for multiculturalism produce an act of such concentrated hate? The answer was neither simple nor comforting. Because violence rarely arrives suddenly. Long before bullets entered that mosque, something else had already entered public discourse. Suspicion. Division. Narratives portraying immigrants as threats. Muslims as outsiders. Refugees as invaders. Those ideas floated across television screens, websites, political debates, and social media feeds until eventually one man stopped seeing strangers as people at all. And on a freezing January night, he carried that belief into a house of worship. For the survivors, time would forever split into two parts. Life before the shooting. And life after it. Before, the mosque had been sanctuary. Afterward, every doorway carried memory. Every prayer carried ghosts. Every winter snowfall brought back the sound of gunfire echoing across a prayer hall stained red. Even years later, some survivors admitted they still remembered tiny details most clearly. The squeak of boots against tile. The smell of gunpowder mixing with winter jackets. The sight of someone reaching for help before disappearing beneath chaos. Trauma preserves strange things. Not entire stories. Fragments. Sharp little pieces that never fully leave. And perhaps that is why this case still haunts Canada nearly a decade later. Because it shattered an illusion. The illusion that extremism only exists elsewhere. The illusion that hatred always looks monstrous before it kills. The illusion that peaceful societies are somehow immune. On January 29, 2017, 6 men entered a mosque to pray. Only bloodstains remained where some of them fell. And outside, snow continued to fall over Quebec City as if the world itself had not yet realized something irreversible had happened inside that building. Quebec City in winter looked like a postcard to anyone seeing it for the first time. Snow rested softly on cathedral roofs. Old stone buildings glowed beneath amber streetlights. Tourists walked through the historic district wrapped in scarves and thick coats while horse-drawn carriages moved slowly across icy roads. To outsiders, the city carried an almost dreamlike calm. Safe neighborhoods. Low crime rates. A deeply rooted French-Canadian identity shaped by history, religion, and tradition. It was not the kind of place most people associated with terrorism, political violence, or mass murder. But beneath the quiet beauty of Quebec City, tensions had already begun building long before January 2017. The province of Quebec had spent years wrestling with complicated questions about identity, immigration, and secularism. Political debates around religion had become increasingly emotional. Discussions about Muslim women wearing hijabs, refugee resettlement, and cultural accommodation filled television panels and newspaper headlines. For many residents, these debates felt philosophical, abstract. But for Muslim communities living there, the conversations often felt painfully personal. The Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec stood in the Sainte-Foy district, a relatively peaceful suburban area not far from Laval University. The mosque itself was modest. It did not dominate the neighborhood skyline. No giant domes. No towering minarets. From the outside, it looked almost ordinary, blending quietly among nearby buildings and snow-covered parking lots. But for hundreds of Muslim families in Quebec City, it was far more than a place of prayer. It was home. Inside those walls, immigrants built new lives together. Arabic mixed with French and English in the hallways. Children chased each other through corridors after weekend classes. Families gathered during Ramadan to break fast together while winter winds rattled outside. Newcomers who arrived in Canada feeling isolated often found their first friendships there. Some worshippers had escaped war zones in Algeria, Guinea, Tunisia, Morocco, and Syria. Others came seeking education, work, or safety for their children. The mosque became a bridge between worlds. And like many immigrant communities, the people there carried invisible histories with them. Some had seen civil wars firsthand. Some had survived authoritarian governments. Some left behind parents they would never see again. Yet despite those burdens, many believed Canada represented stability. A country where their children could grow up without fear. A country where difference was accepted rather than punished. For years, that belief seemed mostly true. Neighbors described the mosque community as peaceful and welcoming. During open house events, non-Muslim residents were invited inside to learn about Islamic traditions. Volunteers organized food drives and charity work. Teachers from local schools sometimes visited with students. The atmosphere inside the center reflected ordinary human routines rather than political ideology. Prayer schedules taped to walls. Coffee brewing in the kitchen. Men discussing hockey scores before evening worship. But outside the mosque, something was changing across the Western world. By 2016, global politics had entered an unusually volatile period. Terrorist attacks carried out by ISIS in Paris, Brussels, Nice, and other cities dominated international news. Images of explosions, armed police, and grieving crowds circulated constantly online. Fear spread rapidly through social media, often detached from nuance or context. Across Europe and North America, right-wing nationalist movements gained momentum by promising stronger borders and tougher immigration policies. In the United States, Donald Trump's presidential campaign drew enormous attention for its rhetoric surrounding Muslims and refugees. In France, Marine Le Pen's anti-immigration messaging reached millions. Online forums became breeding grounds for conspiracy theories claiming Western societies were under invasion. Terms like replacement and cultural threat entered mainstream conversation. And in bedrooms illuminated by laptop screens late at night, isolated young men consumed those ideas endlessly. Alexandre Bissonnette was one of them. Long before investigators learned his name, he had already spent years drifting through a world of anger and resentment online. Friends and classmates would later describe him as socially awkward, anxious, intensely withdrawn. He struggled with bullying growing up. Some remembered him as intelligent but emotionally fragile. Others described sudden bursts of rage hidden beneath an otherwise timid personality. He was born in 1989 and raised in Cap Rouge, a suburban area near Quebec City. On paper, his upbringing appeared stable. Middle-class family. Catholic background. Good education. Nothing in his childhood immediately predicted the horror that would come later. Yet beneath that normal exterior, certain traits slowly intensified over time. Isolation. Obsession. Resentment. People who knew him described a young man who often seemed uncomfortable around others. He had difficulty fitting into social groups. Conversations reportedly drifted toward politics and controversial topics. Online, however, he found spaces where his frustrations transformed into identity. The internet gave him what real life often did not. Attention. Validation. A sense of belonging. By his 20s, Bissonnette had developed a fixation on political extremism and mass violence. He followed far-right commentators online. He consumed anti-immigration content obsessively. Reports later revealed he admired figures known for nationalist rhetoric. News coverage about terrorism appeared to deepen his hostility toward Muslims rather than generate empathy for victims. And like many radicalized individuals, he did not emerge overnight as a monster. The transformation was gradual. Small steps. A comment here. A video there. A growing inability to separate individuals from political fears. Meanwhile, life inside the mosque continued normally. On weekdays, worshippers arrived after work carrying snow-covered boots into the entrance hall. Children attended Quran lessons upstairs. During Friday prayers, parking spaces filled quickly as families gathered together. Some worshippers drove across the city despite harsh winter roads because the mosque represented more than religion. It represented continuity, identity, community. One of those regular worshippers was Azzeddine Soufiane. Originally from Morocco, Soufiane owned a grocery store and was deeply involved in the local Muslim community. Friends described him as warm and generous, someone who remembered names and checked on people quietly without seeking praise. He often volunteered at the mosque and helped newcomers adjust to life in Canada. Another was Khaled Belkacemi, an Algerian-born university professor known for his intelligence and gentle demeanor. Students admired him. Colleagues respected him. At home, he was a husband and father trying to build a future in a country he believed valued education and tolerance. Then there was Mamadou Tanu Barry, who worked for the provincial government and spent years creating a stable life after immigrating from Guinea. Friends remembered his kindness and his constant smile. Each of the 6 victims carried similar stories. Men who had crossed oceans believing Canada offered peace. Men who woke up every morning thinking about work, children, bills, responsibilities, and ordinary dreams. Not one of them imagined they were being silently hated by someone they had never met. The months leading up to the attack were marked by increasing hostility toward Muslim communities globally. In Quebec specifically, debates around identity politics became deeply emotional. Radio hosts discussed immigration anxieties daily. Online comment sections grew more toxic. Acts of vandalism and hate speech occasionally targeted mosques across Canada. In June 2016, months before the shooting, someone had left a pig's head outside the Quebec City Mosque during Ramadan. The message was unmistakable. Worshippers were disturbed but continued gathering there anyway. Many believed such hatred represented a loud minority rather than a serious threat. Canada still felt fundamentally safe compared to the violence many immigrants had already escaped elsewhere. But fear had begun settling quietly beneath the surface. Some Muslim families became more cautious. Parents discussed whether children should walk alone at night. Community leaders worried about increasing anti-Muslim rhetoric online. Yet daily life continued because daily life always does, even when danger approaches unnoticed. Winter in Quebec has a way of trapping people indoors. Long nights. Endless snow. Silence pressing against windows after sunset. During January 2017, temperatures often dropped far below freezing. Cars struggled to start in the mornings. Sidewalks disappeared beneath ice. Most people moved quickly from heated homes to workplaces without lingering outdoors. Inside his own increasingly isolated world, Alexandre Bissonnette spent more and more time online. Investigators later uncovered evidence suggesting he had researched previous mass shootings extensively. He appeared fascinated by gunmen who transformed personal anger into public violence. The digital spaces he inhabited rewarded fear and outrage. Muslims were discussed not as neighbors or families but as demographic threats, invaders, symbols of societal decline. Over time, language like that changes perception. Once people become symbols instead of human beings, cruelty becomes easier. History proves this repeatedly. The victims inside the mosque never knew they had become characters inside someone else's distorted worldview. And perhaps that is what makes the tragedy especially horrifying. The disconnect between reality and hatred. Because if Bissonnette had walked into the mosque weeks earlier during a community dinner, he would not have found extremists or enemies. He would have found exhausted fathers helping children with homework. Men laughing over tea. Volunteers organizing charity work. Immigrants navigating life in a foreign country while trying to preserve traditions for their families. Ordinary people. But extremism depends on abstraction. It requires reducing human beings into categories. Muslim. Immigrant. Threat. And once those labels harden inside a vulnerable mind, violence begins feeling less impossible. In the days before the attack, nothing outwardly signaled what was coming. No public threats. No manifesto released beforehand. No dramatic warning signs visible to the broader community. Bissonnette attended classes. He moved through the city unnoticed. The mosque continued preparing for another ordinary week of winter prayer services. Snowstorms swept through Quebec City repeatedly that January. Cars vanished beneath white drifts overnight. Pedestrians lowered their heads against icy winds. The city looked peaceful from a distance, wrapped beneath layers of white and silence. Yet beneath that silence, two worlds were moving steadily toward collision. One world built around prayer, family, and belonging. the other around alienation, resentment, and radicalization. Neither side truly saw the other. And that invisibility would prove catastrophic. For many Canadians, the idea of domestic right-wing extremism still felt abstract in 2017. Terrorism was often imagined as something imported from elsewhere. Discussions focused heavily on jihadist violence overseas. Far-right radicalization received far less public attention despite growing warning signs internationally. The Quebec mosque attack would force that conversation into the open. But before the headlines, before candlelight vigils and political speeches, before investigators reconstructed timelines and motives, there was simply an ordinary winter weekend unfolding across the city. Families grocery shopping. Students studying for exams. Children playing in snowbanks beneath darkening skies. And inside the Islamic Cultural Center, worshippers preparing once again to kneel shoulder to shoulder for evening prayer, believing they were safe inside the country they had chosen to call home. Before the gunfire. Before the police lights stained the snow red and blue. Before their names appeared on television screens across Canada, the 6 men killed inside the Quebec City Mosque were simply living ordinary lives. That is often the cruelest thing about tragedies like this. The victims are remembered for the way they died, while the long, complicated stories of how they lived slowly fade behind headlines and statistics. 6 dead. 19 injured. Numbers repeated so often they begin to lose shape. But inside the mosque that night were fathers, husbands, sons, teachers, friends. Men who carried routines, memories, habits, private fears, and unfinished plans into that prayer hall without realizing they would never walk back out. Winter mornings in Quebec City started before sunrise for many immigrants. The cold demanded discipline. Cars needed extra time to warm up. Sidewalks had to be shoveled before work. Thick frost gathered on apartment windows overnight while heaters rattled endlessly against the freezing air outside. Most of the men who attended the Islamic Cultural Center lived lives structured around responsibility. Long hours. Family obligations. Community ties. Their schedules revolved around work and prayer in a country they had spent years trying to build a future in. Azedine Soufiane understood hard work intimately. Born in Morocco, he eventually immigrated to Canada searching for opportunity and stability. Friends described him as deeply compassionate, the kind of man who naturally took care of others without drawing attention to himself. He owned a small grocery business in Saint Foy and became well known among local families. Customers remembered his patience, his calm smile, the way he greeted people warmly no matter how exhausted he looked after long days behind the counter. His store became more than a business. It became a meeting point. Students stopped by after class. Immigrant families searched for familiar foods reminding them of home. New arrivals to Quebec often found themselves speaking with Soufiane about schools, jobs, apartments, or paperwork. He understood the loneliness of immigration and quietly tried easing it for others whenever he could. At home, he was a husband and father. The kind of father who worried constantly about providing enough. Like many immigrants, he carried the invisible pressure of proving the sacrifice had been worth it. Late nights balancing finances. Early mornings opening the store before sunrise. Calls to relatives overseas asking about aging parents he could not visit often enough. People close to him remembered his laughter most clearly. Not loud laughter. Gentle laughter. The kind that softened tense rooms. On winter evenings after work, he often went to the mosque not only to pray but to reconnect with community members who had become extended family over the years. In immigrant communities, places of worship frequently become emotional anchors. People share meals there, seek advice there, celebrate births there, mourn losses there. For Soufiane, the mosque represented familiarity in a foreign country. Khaled Belkacemi carried a very different life story, but the same quiet determination. Born in Algeria, he eventually became a professor at Laval University. Education shaped his identity deeply. Colleagues admired his intelligence and discipline. Students remembered him as approachable and patient, someone who genuinely cared whether they succeeded. He specialized in public administration and was respected academically, but outside university halls he was simply a husband and father trying to create stability for his family. Friends described Belkacemi as thoughtful and reserved. He loved books. Discussions about politics and philosophy interested him, though he rarely raised his voice during disagreements. At home, he spent time helping his children with schoolwork and encouraging them to pursue ambitious futures. He believed education opened doors that prejudice could not permanently close. Like many immigrants, he existed between two worlds. One foot rooted in memories of Algeria. The other in the future he hoped Canada could offer his children. The mosque gave him continuity, language, familiar customs, shared identity in a city where Muslims still represented a small minority. Then there was Mamadou Tanu Barry. Originally from Guinea, Barry worked for the Quebec government in information technology. Friends described him as energetic, optimistic, and deeply social. He loved conversation. Loved gathering with people after prayer to discuss life, sports, politics, and family. Those who knew him often mentioned his smile first. Wide, genuine, constant. Barry had built a life many immigrants dream about achieving. Stable career, family, respect within his community. But behind those achievements existed years of adaptation and sacrifice invisible to most outsiders. Learning new systems, new language dynamics, new cultural expectations. Immigrants often carry exhaustion quietly because survival depends on persistence. Barry understood that reality, yet still maintained warmth toward others. He attended the mosque regularly, where friendships formed naturally among men navigating similar experiences. Abubakar Thabti was another familiar face there. Born in Tunisia, he worked in the pharmaceutical industry and was known for his generosity. Younger members of the mosque community often approached him for guidance because he listened carefully before speaking. Friends remembered his humility. The way he avoided attention despite helping people constantly. Some nights after prayer, he lingered in the mosque parking lot talking with friends while snow piled around their cars. Conversations drifted between French and Arabic. Discussions about children, bills, politics back home. The ordinary details that build human connection. To outsiders, such moments appear insignificant. But later, after tragedy, survivors remember them with painful clarity. The last handshake. The final joke. A casual goodbye that unknowingly became permanent. Ibrahima Barry, another victim originally from Guinea, worked in the financial sector and was deeply committed to his family. Those who knew him described a disciplined man who valued routine and faith. He often balanced demanding work schedules with active involvement in the mosque community. Friends recalled seeing him arrive directly from work still carrying exhaustion in his posture, yet always making time for evening prayer. And then there was Abdelkrim Hussein, a father of 3. A government worker. A man survivors would later describe as courageous during the attack itself. Originally from Algeria, Hussein was known for his kindness and reliability. Friends trusted him easily. Family members depended on him. In photographs taken before the shooting, his expression often appeared calm and thoughtful, the face of someone carrying responsibilities carefully rather than loudly. These 6 men came from different countries, different professions, different personal histories. Yet their lives intersected inside the Islamic Cultural Center because all of them believed they had found belonging there. The mosque itself reflected the immigrant experience in countless small ways. Children removed snow-covered boots near the entrance after Quran lessons. Volunteers prepared tea in kitchens carrying the aromas of mint, coffee, and spices from North Africa and the Middle East. Bulletin boards displayed community announcements written in French and Arabic. During Ramadan, families gathered long after sunset to break fast together while winter darkness pressed against the windows outside. For many worshippers, the mosque eased the emotional distance between Canada and home. Some members had escaped violence in their countries of origin only to spend years rebuilding emotionally afterward. Others arrived through skilled immigration programs hoping for economic opportunity. Many carried stories of separation from family members left overseas. Immigration often demands quiet grief alongside hope. Phone calls made across time zones. Funerals missed. Children growing up between cultures. Yet despite those challenges, community life inside the mosque remained vibrant. On weekends, children laughed through hallways while parents attended lectures or social events. During major Islamic holidays, the building overflowed with worshippers dressed in elegant traditional clothing. Cars filled every available parking space. Volunteers directed traffic in freezing weather while families embraced one another beneath drifting snow. The victims of January 29th were not isolated strangers randomly gathered together. They were threads woven deeply into a living community. And outside that community, many Canadians knew almost nothing about them. That invisibility mattered. Because hatred often flourishes where ignorance already exists. To some people radicalized online, Muslims became abstract concepts rather than neighbors. Media narratives reduced millions of individuals into simplified fears surrounding terrorism, immigration, or cultural change. Complex human beings disappeared beneath stereotypes repeated often enough to feel true. But inside the mosque, life remained stubbornly ordinary. One survivor later remembered seeing worshippers discussing hockey scores minutes before the attack. Another recalled someone joking about the brutal weather outside. Men checked phones for work messages. Fathers reminded children to behave quietly. Coats dripped melted snow near radiators while prayer preparations continued peacefully. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested imminent horror. The victims themselves reflected the broader immigrant reality in Canada. They contributed economically, paid taxes, raised children, pursued careers, volunteered within their communities. Yet they also carried an awareness that acceptance could feel conditional. Many Muslims in Western countries learn to navigate subtle tensions constantly. The lingering stare after hearing an accent. The uncomfortable silence after discussing religion. The casual political conversations questioning whether immigrants truly belong. Most learn to absorb these moments quietly. Continue working. Continue smiling. Continue believing coexistence is possible despite prejudice. For the families of the victims, daily routines before the attack now feel preserved in painful detail. One wife remembered her husband rushing through dinner because he did not want to miss prayer. Another remembered helping zip up a winter jacket before he left the house. Children remembered fathers promising to return soon. No one imagined those ordinary moments would become final memories. That is how tragedy rewrites the past. Afterward, every tiny detail gains unbearable importance. A forgotten coffee cup. A voicemail never answered. A pair of gloves left near the front door. In the weeks after the shooting, media crews interviewed grieving relatives searching for ways to explain unimaginable loss. Family members spoke through tears about men who loved gardening, teaching, cooking, soccer, and family gatherings. Some struggled to understand how strangers could hate their loved ones so intensely without ever meeting them. One widow reportedly could not stop replaying the final goodbye in her mind. Another family member described children asking repeatedly when their father would come home. There are no adequate answers for questions like that. Especially when death arrives through ideology rather than personal conflict. Because the victims inside the Quebec mosque were targeted not for what they had done, but for what they represented inside the shooter's imagination. And still, reducing them solely to victims feels incomplete. They were builders of lives. Builders of families. Builders of community. Their deaths devastated far more than immediate relatives. Entire social circles fractured afterward. Friends struggled with survivors' guilt. Community leaders faced overwhelming grief while trying to support traumatized families. Children who attended the mosque lost mentors and father figures overnight. Even those who survived physically carried permanent emotional wounds. Some worshippers later admitted they no longer felt safe kneeling during prayer. Others became hyper-aware of exits in every building they entered. Simple sounds, a slammed door, sudden shouting, triggered panic years later. Trauma reshapes ordinary life in invisible ways. Yet amid the grief, stories about the victims continued surfacing. Stories of generosity, of resilience, of men who spent years building peace in a society where they occasionally felt viewed with suspicion. And perhaps that is what makes their loss especially tragic. The contrast between who they truly were and the fearful caricatures that motivated their killer. On the night of January 29, 2017, 6 men entered the mosque carrying thoughts of work schedules, family responsibilities, unfinished conversations, and ordinary hopes for the future. One worried about bills. Another planned upcoming university work. One intended to wake early the next morning. None of them understood they were walking toward the final minutes of their lives. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Quebec City. Inside the mosque, men lined shoulder to shoulder preparing to pray together as they had done countless times before. And somewhere beyond those walls, hatred was already moving toward them through the dark. The evening of January 29, 2017 began like countless other winter nights in Quebec City. Snow rested heavily along sidewalks and parking lots beneath a pale grey sky that darkened early in the Canadian winter. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and cold wind pushed fine crystals of snow across quiet suburban streets in Saint Foy. Most people were already indoors by sunset. Curtains closed. Heaters running. Television light flickering through windows while families settled into the familiar rhythm of Sunday night routines before another workweek began. Inside the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec, worshippers gradually arrived for evening prayer. Boots tracked slush across entrance mats. Jackets thick with winter frost were hung beside scarves and gloves near the front hallway. Men greeted one another softly, some exchanging quick embraces before entering the prayer area. The atmosphere felt peaceful and ordinary. Familiar faces gathered beneath fluorescent lights while quiet conversations drifted between French, Arabic, and English. Some worshippers had driven through difficult road conditions after long work shifts. Others came directly from family dinners. Several children had already gone home earlier in the evening while adult worshippers remained for prayer and conversation. No one sensed danger waiting beyond the walls. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Alexandre Bissonnette sat alone inside his vehicle. The city moved normally around him. Traffic lights changed methodically at icy intersections. Snowplows pushed fresh drifts aside along major roads. People hurried between stores carrying groceries into the cold. Somewhere nearby, families laughed over dinner tables completely unaware that within the next hour, Quebec City would become the scene of one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern Canadian history. Inside the car, Bissonnette appeared calm. Investigators would later reconstruct portions of his movements that evening, piecing together timelines from surveillance footage, witness accounts, and digital evidence. He had armed himself with a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun. Extra ammunition waited nearby. Every action suggested preparation rather than impulse. And yet outwardly, nothing about him would have immediately alarmed strangers passing on the street. That remains one of the most unsettling aspects of mass violence. The ordinariness before horror. No dramatic soundtrack. No visible warning sign. Just a young man driving through winter streets carrying enough hatred to destroy multiple lives in minutes. Inside the mosque, evening prayer preparations continued peacefully. The prayer hall itself was simple. Clean carpets stretched across the floor. Shelves held copies of the Quran near the walls. Coats and winter boots remained piled near entrances while worshippers lined up shoulder to shoulder. Some men closed their eyes quietly before prayer began. Others whispered greetings to late arrivals entering from the cold. Several survivors would later remember tiny details from those final peaceful moments with painful clarity. Someone adjusting his scarf. A cell phone vibrating briefly before being silenced. The muffled sound of wind pressing against the building outside. Human memory behaves strangely during trauma. The brain preserves fragments unpredictably. Small details become permanent while larger sequences blur into confusion. Around 7:55 p.m., the evening prayer was underway. Rows of worshippers bowed in unison toward the carpeted floor. The room carried the familiar rhythm of collective prayer. Calm breathing. Quiet recitation. Bodies moving together through practiced motions repeated thousands of times throughout their lives. Then the front door opened. At first, no one reacted strongly. People occasionally arrived late. Worshippers moved in and out during prayer services, often enough that footsteps near the entrance barely registered. A few men glanced briefly toward the back before returning focus to prayer. Then came the first gunshot. The sound exploded through the mosque with terrifying force. Inside enclosed spaces, gunfire does not resemble what people hear in movies. It is sharper, louder, violent enough to physically disorient the body. For a split second, confusion swept the room. Several worshippers instinctively lifted their heads. Some appeared frozen between disbelief and recognition, their minds struggling to process what they had heard. Then came another shot. And another. Panic detonated instantly. Alexandre Bissonnette had entered the prayer hall armed and firing directly into the crowd. The atmosphere transformed from peace into absolute chaos within seconds. Men screamed. Bodies collapsed. People dove desperately toward the floor, searching for cover that barely existed inside the open prayer space. Some attempted crawling beneath one another while others rushed toward exits already clogged with terrified worshippers trying to escape simultaneously. Gunfire echoed relentlessly against walls and ceilings. Bullets tore through bodies, glass, carpet, and furniture. One survivor later described the sound as endless even though the attack itself lasted less than 2 minutes. Time distorts during extreme trauma. Seconds stretch unnaturally long. Thoughts fragment into instinct. Survival becomes physical rather than logical. Near the entrance, some worshippers attempted to stop the shooter despite being unarmed. One survivor later recalled seeing men trying to shield others while bullets struck around them. Another remembered hearing cries for help mixed with prayers and screams in multiple languages. The gunman continued firing methodically. Witnesses later described him moving through the mosque with chilling calmness. There was no argument. No warning. No negotiation. Only gunfire directed into a room filled almost entirely with defenseless people kneeling in prayer moments earlier. Azzedine Soufiane was among those hit. So was Khaled Belkacemi, Mamadou Tanu Barry, Aboubaker Thapti, Abdelkrim Hussein, Ibrahima Barry. Some victims collapsed instantly. Others remained conscious long enough to understand what was happening around them. One survivor later remembered seeing wounded men reaching toward others while blood spread rapidly across the carpet. Another described hearing people reciting prayers through gasping breaths. The room became a landscape of confusion and terror almost too overwhelming for memory itself to fully retain. A few worshippers managed escaping through side exits into the freezing night. Several ran without coats into deep snow, driven entirely by adrenaline. Others hid in offices, bathrooms, or storage spaces inside the building while trying desperately to stay silent. One man reportedly barricaded himself and others behind a locked door while listening to gunshots continue nearby. Inside the prayer hall, the wounded cried out for help. Some attempted using jackets to stop bleeding. Others lay motionless beside overturned chairs and shattered glass. The fluorescent lighting remained painfully bright throughout the attack, illuminating every horrifying detail with clinical clarity. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, the gunfire stopped. The silence afterward felt unreal. Not peaceful silence. The stunned, broken silence that follows catastrophe. Moans echoed through the prayer hall. Cell phones rang unanswered beside bodies. Some survivors remained frozen on the floor, unsure whether the shooter was still nearby. Others crawled cautiously toward wounded friends or relatives, their hands slipping through blood across the carpet. Outside, snow continued falling softly beneath streetlights. Several worshippers who escaped immediately called emergency services. Their voices shook uncontrollably as they tried explaining what had happened. Dispatchers struggled to gather coherent information through overlapping panic. Reports varied wildly during those first minutes. Multiple shooters. Hostages. Terrorist attack. Active gunman still inside. Police units rushed toward the mosque from across Quebec City. Paramedics followed close behind. Inside his vehicle, Alexandre Bissonnette fled the scene. Investigators later determined he drove away alone into the winter night after the shooting ended. Witnesses outside the mosque had seen only fragments of the chaos. A man entering. Gunshots erupting. Survivors running into snow-covered parking lots screaming for help. At approximately 8:10 p.m., less than 20 minutes after the attack began, police received another shocking development. The suspected shooter called 911 himself. His voice reportedly sounded controlled, almost detached emotionally from the massacre he had just committed. During the call, he identified himself and provided information regarding his location. Officers tracked his vehicle near the Isle d'Orléans bridge outside Quebec City. When police surrounded the car, Bissonnette surrendered peacefully. No shootout. No resistance. No dramatic confrontation. Just flashing emergency lights reflecting against snow and ice while a 27-year-old university student stepped out of his vehicle into police custody. Back at the mosque, the situation remained catastrophic. Emergency personnel entered scenes many would later describe as unforgettable. Blood-covered sections of the prayer hall floor. Shoes, coats, and personal belongings lay scattered everywhere from the chaos of people attempting escape. Some victims still showed signs of life while paramedics rushed desperately between them. Others were already gone. Officers moved carefully through the building searching for additional threats while survivors emerged slowly from hiding places in shock. Several people appeared physically unharmed but psychologically shattered, unable to speak coherently. One survivor wandered outside covered in another victim's blood without realizing he had lost his shoes. The freezing air outside mixed with the metallic smell drifting from inside the mosque. Neighbors gathered behind expanding police barriers staring in disbelief at the growing number of emergency vehicles. Ambulance lights flashed across snowbanks and nearby houses. Helicopters circled overhead. News of the shooting spread rapidly through phones and social media before authorities fully understood the scale of what had occurred. Some early reports mistakenly suggested multiple gunmen remained active. Fear spread quickly throughout Muslim communities across Canada. Inside local homes, family members frantically called loved ones who attended the mosque. Many calls went unanswered. Phones continued vibrating beside bodies inside the building while relatives elsewhere refreshed news updates in mounting panic. At nearby hospitals, trauma teams prepared for mass casualty intake. Doctors and nurses rushed into emergency rooms as ambulances arrived carrying victims suffering gunshot wounds to the chest, legs, abdomen, and head. Some survivors remained conscious enough to ask about friends or relatives still inside the mosque. Others drifted in and out of awareness while medical staff fought to stabilize them. The full death toll emerged slowly through the night. 6 dead. 19 wounded. The scale of the attack stunned the country. For many Canadians, the massacre felt impossible at first. Mass shootings associated with ideological hatred belonged elsewhere in public imagination. Yet now television cameras captured scenes outside a mosque transformed into a crime scene beneath falling snow in Quebec City itself. Political leaders issued statements almost immediately. Security increased around mosques nationwide overnight. Community members gathered crying outside hospitals and police barricades waiting for confirmation about missing relatives. Inside the Islamic Cultural Center, investigators worked carefully through the prayer hall documenting evidence. Bullet casings scattered across the floor. Damaged walls marked by gunfire. Pools of blood beneath fluorescent lights still humming overhead. The mosque no longer resembled sanctuary. It resembled war. And perhaps most haunting of all was how quickly everything had happened. Less than 2 minutes. That was all. In under 120 seconds, 6 lives ended. Families shattered permanently. Survivors traumatized forever. An entire country forced to confront the reality of hatred growing within its own borders. Outside, the winter night remained eerily calm. Snow muffled the city beneath silence while emergency lights flickered endlessly against the dark. And inside the mosque, the final traces of ordinary life still lingered among the devastation. A jacket hanging near the entrance. A half-finished cup of coffee. Rows of prayer rugs stained with blood. Evidence that only moments earlier, this had simply been a place where people gathered peacefully to pray. The first police officers arrived at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec expecting confusion. What they encountered instead was devastation. Emergency lights washed across the snow-covered parking lot in pulsing red and blue while terrified survivors stumbled outside into the freezing January night. Some were crying uncontrollably. Others appeared numb, wandering through the snow in shock with blood on their clothing and no understanding yet of whether friends or family members inside were alive or dead. One man stood near the entrance shaking violently, trying to explain between gasping breaths that people had been shot during prayer. Another survivor pointed toward the building but could barely form words. The cold air carried the smell of snow, exhaust fumes from emergency vehicles, and something darker drifting from inside the mosque. Metallic. Heavy. The smell of fresh blood. Officers moved quickly toward the entrance with weapons drawn, unsure whether the shooter remained inside. Early emergency calls had painted a chaotic picture. Multiple attackers. Active gunfire. Hostages. Nobody knew what was accurate yet. Adrenaline pushed officers through the doors while paramedics waited nearby for clearance to enter. Inside, the scene felt unreal. The mosque's fluorescent lights still glowed overhead with sterile brightness, illuminating destruction that seemed impossible only minutes earlier. Bullet casings littered the floor among overturned chairs and scattered personal belongings. Winter boots remained abandoned near the entrance where worshippers had removed them before prayer. Jackets hung untouched on hooks while nearby, bodies lay motionless across blood-stained carpets. Several victims were still alive. Their breathing shallow. Their clothing soaked dark red. Paramedics rushed forward carrying trauma kits and stretchers while police secured the building room by room searching for additional threats. Some survivors emerged slowly from closets, bathrooms, and storage spaces where they had hidden during the shooting. Many appeared disoriented, unable to process what had happened around them. One survivor reportedly repeated the same sentence over and over. He kept asking whether the shooting was real. Another sat against a wall staring blankly at blood on his hands. Trauma often arrives before comprehension. The mind protects itself by delaying reality, fragmenting memory into disconnected images rather than coherent understanding. In the mosque that night, many survivors existed in that fractured state. They remembered flashes, gunfire, screams, falling bodies, but not yet the full scale of loss unfolding around them. Emergency medical teams worked desperately beneath the harsh white lights. Some victims required immediate resuscitation attempts. Others were beyond saving. Blood soaked into the prayer carpets faster than medics could move between casualties. Every few seconds another survivor cried out a name searching for someone still unaccounted for. Outside, the parking lot transformed into a maze of flashing lights and police tape. Ambulances lined the street while officers pushed crowds farther back from the building. News helicopters circled overhead. Neighbors emerged from nearby homes wrapped in winter coats, staring toward the mosque in disbelief. Quebec City was not accustomed to scenes like this. Violent crime existed, but not massacres inside places of worship. Not executions during prayer. As the night deepened, snowfall continued quietly around the crime scene. Snowflakes drifted through emergency lights like ash. Inside the mosque, investigators began documenting every detail carefully. Forensic teams photographed bullet impacts carved into walls and doors. Blood trails stretching across the floor. Cell phones left behind where victims had fallen. Some devices still vibrated intermittently with incoming calls from worried family members trying desperately to reach loved ones. The unanswered ringing became one of the most haunting details described later by responders. Phones lighting up beside bodies. Ordinary sounds continuing inside extraordinary horror. Near the main prayer area, evidence markers gradually spread across the floor. Yellow tags beside shell casings. Beside bloodstains. Beside torn fragments of clothing. Investigators moved methodically despite the emotional weight pressing through the building. Mass casualty scenes require cold precision. Every bullet trajectory. Every weapon fragment. Every witness statement matters. But even trained investigators struggled emotionally that night. Several officers later admitted the mosque shooting affected them deeply because of the sheer vulnerability of the victims. These were not armed combatants. Not people engaged in conflict. They had been kneeling in prayer moments before the attack began. The contrast between the peaceful setting and the violence inflicted there created a level of psychological shock difficult to separate from the work itself. One section of the prayer hall still showed signs of interrupted normal life. A half-empty water bottle near folded jackets. Religious texts neatly arranged on shelves untouched by gunfire. Prayer rows partially preserved despite the chaos surrounding them. Tiny reminders that this had been an ordinary evening until violence tore through it. Outside hospitals across Quebec City, families gathered in waiting rooms under fluorescent lighting similar to the mosque itself. Some relatives arrived after seeing news alerts online. Others learned through frantic phone calls from survivors. Doctors and nurses moved quickly between trauma rooms while anxious families searched faces entering hallways, hoping not to hear the worst. Several victims underwent emergency surgery through the night. Gunshot wounds to the chest, abdomen, legs, arms. Some survivors remained conscious enough to identify missing friends or relatives before being rushed into operating rooms. Others drifted in and out of awareness, asking repeatedly whether everyone inside the mosque was safe. No one yet fully understood the final death toll. At police headquarters, investigators faced another strange development. The suspected gunman was already in custody. Approximately 20 minutes after the attack, Alexandre Bissonnette had called emergency services himself. Officers intercepted him near the Isle d'Orléans bridge outside the city. When arrested, he surrendered calmly. No resistance. No dramatic confrontation. The contrast between the massacre and the quiet arrest unsettled investigators almost immediately. Mass shooters are often imagined as uncontrollable monsters during public imagination. But reality is frequently colder and more disturbing. Many appear ordinary immediately afterward. Detached. Emotionally distant. Some even cooperative. Bissonnette reportedly spoke with officers while in custody, though details of those early interactions remained tightly controlled during the initial investigation. Authorities quickly began searching his vehicle and later his residence, looking for evidence explaining motive, planning, and ideological influences. Back at the mosque, investigators continued reconstructing the attack minute by minute. Witness statements revealed the shooting had lasted less than 2 minutes. Less than 2 minutes to kill 6 people and wound 19 others. That fact alone haunted many investigators afterward. The speed of modern mass violence often feels incomprehensible. Human lives erased faster than the brain can fully process danger. Survivors described diving beneath one another trying to avoid bullets. Some remembered hearing the shooter reload. Others recalled pretending to be dead while blood from nearby victims spread across the floor beneath them. One witness described seeing worshippers attempting to shield others despite overwhelming panic. Another survivor remembered hearing prayers whispered through pain after the gunfire stopped. As the investigation widened through the night, authorities initially explored the possibility of multiple suspects. Confusion during active shooter events is common. Witnesses under extreme stress often perceive fragmented details differently. Early reports mentioned 2 individuals connected to the scene before investigators clarified that one had merely been present as a witness rather than a participant. Still, uncertainty fueled fear across Canada. Mosques in several cities increased security immediately. Community leaders urged calm while simultaneously warning about rising Islamophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Muslim families across the country watched news coverage with growing anxiety, many wondering whether the Quebec attack represented isolated violence or something larger beginning to emerge. Inside the mosque, Forensic work continued for hours. Investigators measured bullet trajectories carefully across the prayer hall. Firearms experts catalogued ammunition and weapon evidence recovered from the scene and suspect. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby streets, searching for additional details regarding the shooter's arrival and escape route. The emotional weight inside the building intensified as victim identifications progressed. Each confirmation meant another family would soon receive devastating news. Police officers assigned to notification duties prepared for conversations no human being ever truly learns how to handle. Knocking on doors late at night. Entering homes where wives and children still hoped for reassurance. Delivering words that permanently divide lives into before and after. One family member later described sensing tragedy immediately upon seeing police outside the house. Another remembered the unbearable silence following confirmation. No screaming. No collapse. Just silence. The kind of silence created when reality becomes too catastrophic for the mind to immediately absorb. By early morning, media coverage had spread internationally. Television networks replayed aerial footage of the mosque surrounded by emergency vehicles beneath falling snow. Commentators discussed terrorism, hate crimes, and political extremism. Questions emerged rapidly. Was this an act of domestic terrorism? Was the shooter connected to extremist groups? Had authorities missed warning signs? For Muslim communities, however, those broader political discussions felt secondary at first. People were grieving. Friends searched hospitals for survivors. Children waited for fathers who would never return home. Community leaders struggled to organize support while processing their own trauma simultaneously. At the mosque itself, blood remained visible across sections of the carpet long after victims had been transported away. Investigators worked carefully around those stains, documenting evidence while maintaining respect for the religious significance of the space. Some officers reportedly removed shoes before entering certain areas once active threat concerns ended. Even amid catastrophe, small gestures of humanity persisted. Outside, memorials began appearing almost immediately. Flowers froze beneath layers of snow near police barricades. Candles flickered weakly against the winter wind. Handwritten messages in French, English, and Arabic expressed grief, disbelief, solidarity. Some residents who had never entered the mosque before arrived simply to stand silently nearby. The attack shattered something psychological inside Quebec City. A sense of immunity. For years, Canada viewed itself as relatively insulated from the kind of ideological mass violence associated with other countries. The mosque shooting forced a painful confrontation with reality. Hatred existed here too. Radicalization existed here too. And under the right conditions, online extremism could become physical slaughter within a quiet suburban neighborhood. As dawn approached over Quebec City, the mosque remained sealed behind police tape. Snow continued covering the parking lot where survivors had fled hours earlier. Emergency lights finally dimmed as some vehicles departed, but investigators still moved through the building carefully beneath fluorescent glow. Inside the prayer hall, silence had returned. Not the peaceful silence of worship. The heavy silence left behind after violence has passed through a place and changed it forever. Scattered belongings still rested where their owners last touched them. A scarf near the entrance. A single glove beside overturned chairs. Prayer rugs darkened by blood. Evidence not only of death, but of interrupted life. And outside, beyond the barricades and flashing lights, an entire country was beginning to realize that what happened inside the Islamic Cultural Center was not simply a crime scene. It was the aftermath of hatred made real. By the morning after the shooting, Quebec City no longer felt like the same place. Snow still covered the streets. Cafes still opened at dawn. Buses still moved through icy intersections carrying workers into another Monday morning. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of the city, something heavy had settled into the atmosphere. Fear. Grief. Confusion. The sense that a line had been crossed and could never fully be uncrossed again. Outside the Islamic Cultural Center, flowers multiplied rapidly against the police barricades. Candles flickered beneath photographs of the victims while television crews from across Canada and overseas crowded nearby sidewalks. Reporters spoke quietly into microphones as pedestrians stopped behind them, trying to understand how 6 men had been murdered during evening prayer in a country that prided itself on tolerance. Inside police headquarters, investigators worked through the night and into the next day, assembling the first complete picture of the massacre. At the center of that picture stood one name: Alexandre Bissonnette. 27 years old. University student. No major criminal record. No known ties to organized extremist groups. And yet somehow responsible for one of the deadliest acts of anti-Muslim violence in Canadian history. The simplicity of the suspect profile unsettled investigators almost immediately. Mass violence often tempts the public into searching for obvious monsters. People expect dramatic warning signs, secret networks, radical compounds, manifestos scattered across apartment walls. But reality is usually quieter, more intimate, more difficult to predict. Bissonnette had lived an outwardly ordinary life. He studied political science and anthropology at Laval University. He came from a middle-class family. He had classmates, online acquaintances, hobbies. People who encountered him casually often described him as shy or socially awkward rather than openly dangerous. And yet beneath that fragile exterior, something darker had been growing for years. Investigators began combing through his digital history almost immediately. Computers, phones, browsing activity, social media accounts. Modern investigations into extremist violence often unfold partly inside hard drives and search histories because radicalization itself increasingly happens online. What detectives discovered painted the portrait of a deeply isolated man consumed by political resentment and ideological fear. Bissonnette had spent years immersed in far-right online content, anti-immigration rhetoric, nationalist commentary, discussions portraying Muslims as threats to Western society. Investigators found evidence of obsessive political consumption, especially surrounding refugee issues and terrorist attacks overseas. He reportedly followed public figures associated with anti-immigration movements in Europe and North America. Online algorithms had slowly fed him more extreme material over time, reinforcing fears and grievances until entire groups of people became abstractions rather than human beings. The internet did not pull the trigger inside the mosque. But investigators increasingly believed it helped shape the mind that did. As forensic teams continued processing evidence from the crime scene, detectives also began reconstructing Bissonnette's personal history, searching for missed warning signs. Interviews with classmates, acquaintances, former co-workers, and family members revealed fragments of a complicated psychological picture. Many described him as deeply anxious, emotionally withdrawn, prone to isolation. Some former classmates remembered him as awkward but intelligent. Others recalled conversations drifting into angry political territory unexpectedly. A few described sudden mood shifts beneath his otherwise quiet demeanor. There were also reports of bullying during earlier periods of his life. Feelings of social alienation. Difficulty forming stable relationships. None of these factors alone explain mass murder. Millions of isolated or anxious individuals never become violent. Yet investigators recognized familiar patterns appearing gradually beneath the surface. Emotional fragility mixed with ideological obsession. Loneliness transformed into resentment. Fear redirected toward symbolic enemies. As the investigation deepened, another troubling reality emerged. There had been signs of radicalization. But like many modern extremism cases, those signs existed scattered across private online spaces, fragmented conversations, and personal grievances that never fully crossed into visible criminal threats before the attack. This created immediate public debate. Could the massacre have been prevented? Should authorities have recognized warning signs earlier? Was Canada underestimating the danger of far-right extremism? At first, confusion surrounding the case complicated those questions further. During the chaotic early hours after the shooting, police had briefly detained a second man connected to the mosque. Initial witness statements amid panic created uncertainty regarding the possibility of multiple attackers. Media outlets rushed incomplete information onto live broadcasts before investigators clarified that the second individual was not a suspect but a witness who had been present during the attack. That mistake carried painful consequences. Some Muslim community members later expressed frustration about how quickly suspicion initially shifted toward another Muslim man even after a mosque itself had been attacked. The confusion exposed deeper societal anxieties surrounding terrorism, identity, and public perception. Meanwhile, survivors remained trapped inside the psychological aftermath of the massacre. Detectives conducted extensive interviews with worshippers who had survived the attack. Many struggled to recount events coherently because trauma had shattered their memories into disconnected flashes. One remembered seeing muzzle flashes near the entrance. Another recalled falling bodies collapsing beside him before he crawled beneath others pretending to be dead. Some could not remember how they escaped the building at all. Several survivors broke down emotionally during questioning when investigators asked them to identify where victims had fallen inside the prayer hall. The details were unbearable. Friends watching friends die. Men calling for help while bleeding across prayer carpets. The sound of gunfire echoing through a sacred space designed for peace. Investigators approached those interviews carefully, balancing the need for evidence with awareness that survivors themselves remained psychologically wounded. Some worshippers later admitted they avoided sleeping afterward because every time they closed their eyes, they returned to the mosque floor beneath gunfire. The emotional impact spread far beyond immediate survivors. Across Canada, Muslim communities reacted with grief and fear. Mosques hired security personnel. Some congregants became afraid attending evening prayers. Parents worried about children walking near Islamic centers. Community leaders received threatening messages online in the days following the shooting, further intensifying anxiety. At vigils held across major cities, thousands gathered holding candles beneath winter skies. Strangers embraced grieving families. Political leaders condemned the attack publicly. Yet beneath public solidarity lingered another uncomfortable reality. The ideas motivating Bissonnette were not entirely isolated. Anti-Muslim sentiment had been growing visibly across many Western countries for years. Investigators examining his online activity recognized recurring themes common within extremist spaces. Fear of immigration, cultural replacement conspiracies, obsession with terrorist attacks, dehumanizing rhetoric reducing Muslims into collective threats rather than individuals. Modern radicalization often operates differently from traditional organized extremism. There may be no direct recruitment, no formal membership, no secret meetings. Instead, individuals radicalize through endless cycles of digital reinforcement. Videos lead to forums. Forums lead to propaganda. Algorithms reward outrage because outrage sustains engagement. Over time, distorted beliefs stop feeling extreme inside those environments. They begin feeling logical, necessary, even righteous. That realization deeply troubled investigators working the Quebec case. Because it suggested the attack had not emerged from nowhere. It emerged from an ecosystem. As evidence mounted, authorities charged Bissonnette with 6 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. The legal framework quickly became clear. Yet psychologically, the case remained more difficult to fully understand. Why this mosque? Why this moment? Why had anger transformed into massacre? Detectives uncovered evidence that Bissonnette had researched previous mass shootings before the attack. He appeared fascinated by gunmen responsible for ideological violence elsewhere in the world. Such behavior aligned with patterns increasingly observed among lone actor extremists who study earlier attacks almost like scripts. Mass shooters frequently borrow from one another psychologically. Not necessarily through direct communication, but through imitation. One atrocity becomes inspiration for another disturbed mind elsewhere. This possibility intensified fears among law enforcement agencies already concerned about online extremist contagion. As media coverage continued, Journalists also began examining broader political climates surrounding immigration and Islamophobia in Quebec and beyond. Public debate grew heated quickly. Some argued the shooting represented an isolated act committed by a mentally unstable individual. Others insisted it reflected deeper societal hostility toward Muslims normalized through years of inflammatory rhetoric. The truth perhaps existed somewhere painfully in between. Bissonnette alone pulled the trigger. But ideas do not emerge in isolation. Investigators studying his digital behavior noticed how thoroughly his worldview had narrowed over time. Online echo chambers amplified fear while eliminating contradictory human experiences. He did not know the men he murdered personally. He knew only the symbolic versions of Muslims constructed through extremist narratives. The victims became targets long before he entered the mosque. They became targets the moment he stopped seeing them as people. At Laval University, classmates struggled to reconcile the suspect with the massacre itself. Some remembered awkward political debates. Others recalled a quiet student sitting silently during lectures. Few imagined him capable of mass murder. That disconnect haunted the public conversation surrounding the case. How well do people truly know one another? How many individuals carry invisible resentment beneath ordinary lives? And how many radicalize quietly behind screens without anyone recognizing the danger until violence erupts? Back inside the mosque, the physical cleanup eventually began after forensic work concluded. Blood-stained carpets were removed. Bullet-damaged walls repaired. Yet survivors later described the emotional wounds as impossible to erase. Some worshippers could no longer stand in the same prayer positions without remembering where victims had fallen. Others instinctively looked toward entrances during every prayer afterward, unable to fully trust enclosed spaces again. The building itself had become psychologically altered. A sanctuary transformed into a memory of terror. As investigators finalized timelines and forensic analysis, one conclusion became unavoidable. This had not been spontaneous rage. The weapons. The preparation. The ideological background. The deliberate targeting of a mosque during prayer. Everything pointed toward intentional hate-fueled violence. And while detectives assembled evidence methodically inside interview rooms and laboratories, another battle unfolded publicly across Canada. A battle over meaning. Was this terrorism? Was it mental illness? Was it extremism? Or some combination impossible to separate neatly? For grieving families, those debates often felt painfully detached from immediate reality. They were burying fathers, husbands, friends. Children sat beside framed photographs during funerals while snow fell quietly outside mosques now guarded by police vehicles. Community members embraced one another through tears, struggling to understand how ordinary life had collapsed so violently in under 2 minutes. And somewhere inside detention walls, Alexandre Bissonnette sat alone while investigators continued uncovering the path that led him from political obsession to mass murder. A path shaped not only by personal darkness, but by a world increasingly saturated with fear, division, and hatred disguised as ideology. In the weeks following the Quebec City mosque shooting, investigators began realizing they were not simply examining a mass murder case. They were staring into a mirror reflecting something larger and more disturbing growing quietly beneath modern society. At first, the evidence appeared straightforward. The shooter had surrendered. Weapons had been recovered. Witnesses identified him. Surveillance footage tracked his movements. The legal question of who committed the attack was never truly in doubt. But understanding why became far more complicated. Inside interrogation rooms and forensic labs, investigators continued piecing together the psychological pathway that transformed Alexandre Bissonnette from an isolated university student into a man capable of walking into a mosque and opening fire on praying strangers. The deeper they looked, the clearer one truth became. This massacre had not emerged from a single moment of rage. It had been built slowly. Layer by layer. Fear by fear. Click by click. Detectives assigned to digital forensic analysis spent countless hours reviewing Bissonnette's online activity. Modern extremist investigations increasingly resemble archaeological excavations through internet history. Search queries, video recommendations, forum discussions, social media interactions. Tiny fragments revealing how a person's worldview evolved over time. What they found painted a portrait of escalating radicalization. He consumed vast amounts of political content centered around immigration, terrorism, nationalism, and cultural fear. He followed far-right commentators and political figures known for inflammatory rhetoric about Muslims and refugees. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting he obsessively monitored terrorist attacks around the world, not from empathy for victims, but from fixation and anger. One pattern particularly alarmed investigators. Bissonnette appeared deeply influenced by the emotional atmosphere of online extremism rather than direct organizational recruitment. That distinction mattered. Traditional terrorism often relies on structured groups, leadership hierarchies, recruitment systems, and coordinated planning. But lone actor radicalization operates differently. Individuals absorb ideology through decentralized ecosystems where propaganda hides inside memes, videos, comment sections, and political outrage. Nobody explicitly orders the violence. The environment itself slowly normalizes it. And by 2017, that environment had become increasingly toxic across large parts of the internet. Investigators uncovered evidence showing Bissonnette's growing obsession with anti-Muslim narratives. Discussions framing refugees as invaders. Claims that Western civilization faced demographic collapse. Repeated exposure to fear-driven content portraying Muslims not as individuals, but as existential threats. The most chilling realization was how ordinary his radicalization looked digitally. No secret dark web manifesto. No dramatic declarations. Mostly endless consumption of anger. The kind millions encounter daily online. This became the investigation's turning point psychologically, because it forced authorities to confront an uncomfortable possibility. If someone like Bissonnette could radicalize quietly within mainstream digital spaces, how many others might be traveling similar paths unnoticed? Meanwhile, survivors and victims' families continued living inside the emotional wreckage of the attack. Funerals unfolded beneath grey winter skies while entire communities gathered in grief. Men stood shoulder to shoulder outside mosques wrapped in heavy coats against the cold. Some cried openly. Others remained silent, faces frozen somewhere between sorrow and disbelief. Children clung to mothers asking questions impossible to answer. Why would someone kill their father during prayer? How do adults explain hatred to children without passing the hatred forward? Inside the mosque itself, restoration efforts continued slowly. Bullet holes were repaired. Carpets replaced. Damaged walls repainted. Yet survivors repeatedly described feeling that the building itself had changed permanently. Places absorb memory. And some memories never fully leave. Several worshippers admitted they could no longer pray comfortably near entrances after the attack. Others instinctively scanned rooms for exits during gatherings. One survivor later described hearing phantom echoes of gunfire whenever silence settled too heavily inside enclosed spaces. Trauma had rewired their sense of safety. Back inside the investigation, another critical breakthrough emerged through psychiatric evaluations and personal testimony. Experts examining Bissonnette described severe social isolation combined with obsessive thinking patterns and emotional fragility. He reportedly struggled with anxiety and feelings of inadequacy for years. Friends described him as withdrawn and deeply uncomfortable socially. But investigators gradually realized something important. Mental instability alone did not explain the massacre. Millions struggle with anxiety, depression, or isolation without becoming violent extremists. The decisive factor appeared to be ideological fixation combined with emotional vulnerability. Bissonnette did not simply hate randomly. His hatred followed narratives. Structured fears. Political myths repeated often enough that they hardened into perceived reality. Investigators also uncovered evidence suggesting he feared refugee immigration intensely during the Syrian refugee crisis dominating international headlines at the time. News coverage showing terrorist attacks overseas appeared to deepen his paranoia rather than create compassion for victims. Over time, his worldview narrowed until entire groups of people became symbols inside his mind. Muslims no longer represented neighbors, professors, fathers, or grocery store owners. They became threats, abstract enemies. And abstraction is dangerous because it strips away empathy. It becomes easier to kill symbols than human beings. As detectives reconstructed his final days before the attack, they found no evidence of elaborate conspiracy or assistance from organized extremist cells. That realization proved deeply unsettling for Canadian law enforcement agencies already monitoring terrorism threats nationwide. The mosque massacre had been carried out by one man operating largely alone. A lone actor shaped by ideology spreading through ordinary digital spaces. The implications extended far beyond Quebec City. National security agencies began reassessing how they approached domestic extremism investigations. For years, public attention focused primarily on foreign terrorist organizations and jihadist threats. Far-right radicalization received comparatively less scrutiny despite mounting incidents internationally. The Quebec attack shattered that imbalance. Investigators and analysts now faced a reality impossible to ignore. Extremist violence in Canada did not always come from abroad. Sometimes it emerged from bedrooms, laptops, and quiet suburban neighborhoods. Public debate intensified rapidly. Politicians argued over terminology. Was the mosque shooting terrorism? Hate crime? Mass murder? Mental illness? Legal experts weighed definitions carefully while Muslim communities expressed frustration that anti-Muslim violence often seemed treated differently than other forms of terrorism. For survivors, those semantic debates sometimes felt exhausting. The experience itself had already answered the question emotionally. A man entered a mosque during prayer specifically targeting Muslims. Whatever label society chose afterward could not change the terror inside that room. As media coverage expanded internationally, journalists uncovered additional details about Bissonnette's ideological influences. Reports emerged regarding his admiration for nationalist political figures and online rhetoric opposing immigration. Former acquaintances recalled increasingly aggressive political conversations in the months before the shooting. Yet many people who knew him casually still struggled to reconcile those details with the quiet young man they remembered. That contradiction became another key breakthrough in understanding modern extremism. Danger no longer always announces itself loudly. Some radicals isolate rather than recruit. They consume rather than preach publicly. They drift inward until violence erupts suddenly without broader networks fully visible beforehand. Law enforcement agencies across Canada quietly began reviewing other cases involving online extremism patterns. Analysts studied digital communities where fear and conspiracy merged into increasingly dehumanizing narratives. The Quebec attack forced authorities to recognize how rapidly ideology could intensify inside algorithm-driven environments designed to maximize emotional engagement. Outrage keeps users online longer. Fear spreads faster than nuance. And isolated individuals searching for meaning often sink deepest into those systems. The investigation also revealed another haunting truth. Bissonnette had likely been psychologically rehearsing violence long before the attack itself. Detectives found evidence of interest in previous mass shootings and extremist violence internationally. Like many lone actor killers, he appeared fascinated by earlier perpetrators. Their notoriety, their methods, their ability to force themselves into public consciousness through bloodshed. Mass violence can become contagious psychologically. Each atrocity leaves behind not only grief, but scripts for future unstable minds searching for identity through destruction. This realization deeply disturbed investigators working the case. Because preventing such attacks becomes extraordinarily difficult when radicalization happens privately inside fragmented online ecosystems rather than centralized organizations. Meanwhile, survivors faced quieter battles invisible to the public. Some could no longer sleep without medication. Others experienced panic attacks hearing sudden loud noises. One survivor reportedly struggled entering any crowded building afterward because every enclosed space triggered memories of the mosque. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. Its psychological consequences would last decades. Families of the victims also endured secondary waves of trauma as investigation details emerged publicly. Court filings, media reports, autopsy findings, ballistic evidence. Every new revelation reopened grief. Some relatives avoided news coverage entirely because hearing specifics about the final moments became unbearable. And still, many family members insisted on speaking publicly despite the pain. Not for revenge, but for recognition. They wanted Canadians to understand who the victims truly were beyond headlines. Fathers, teachers, public servants, men who spent years contributing peacefully to the country that ultimately failed to protect them. As investigators finalized evidence packages for prosecution, the broader meaning of the case continued expanding nationally. Academics studied radicalization pathways. Security experts warned about online extremist ecosystems. Muslim advocacy groups pushed for stronger responses to hate crimes and Islamophobia. The mosque shooting had become more than a criminal investigation. It became a national reckoning. A confrontation with uncomfortable truths about prejudice, digital radicalization, and the fragility of social cohesion in an age where fear spreads instantly across screens. And at the center of it all remained one devastatingly simple reality. 6 innocent men had walked into a mosque to pray. They never came home. Everything investigators uncovered afterward, the politics, the psychology, the algorithms, the ideology, could explain the pathway toward violence. But none of it could undo what happened inside that prayer hall on a freezing January night. Because some breakthroughs arrive too late. And sometimes the most horrifying discovery of all is realizing the warning signs were always there, scattered quietly across conversations, online spaces, and growing divisions that too many people dismissed until blood finally forced the world to pay attention. By the time Alexandra Bissonnette entered the courtroom, the massacre at the Quebec City Mosque had already scarred the country permanently. The snow from January 2017 had long melted. Seasons changed. News cycles moved forward. Yet for survivors and victims' families, time remained trapped inside that prayer hall. Every court appearance forced them to reopen memories they had spent months trying desperately to survive. The courtroom itself carried an atmosphere unlike ordinary criminal proceedings. Heavy silence settled over spectators before hearings even began. Security officers stood alert near entrances while journalists filled benches with notebooks and cameras waiting for every detail. Family members of the victims often arrived quietly together, moving through hallways with the exhausted posture of people carrying grief for too long. Some survivors avoided looking toward the defense table entirely. Others stared directly at Bissonnette with expressions beyond anger. The kind of emptiness trauma leaves behind when rage itself no longer feels large enough. And at the center of the room sat the man responsible for 6 deaths and 19 injuries. Alexandra Bissonnette did not resemble the public imagination of evil. No tattoos. No theatrical outbursts. No cold cinematic villainy. Instead, observers often described him as pale, nervous, almost fragile-looking. He sat quietly through proceedings, occasionally lowering his head while lawyers discussed the massacre in procedural language that somehow made the horror feel even stranger. Because mass murder creates a disturbing contradiction inside courtrooms. The violence itself feels unimaginable. Yet the legal process surrounding it becomes methodical and clinical. Dates, charges, evidence, procedure. As though paperwork could fully contain what happened inside the mosque. The prosecution assembled an overwhelming case. 6 counts of first-degree murder. Multiple counts of attempted murder. Detailed forensic evidence. Witness testimony. Surveillance footage. Digital records revealing ideological fixation and planning. There was never serious doubt regarding guilt itself. The evidence was simply too extensive. Ballistics matched weapons recovered from the suspect. Survivors identified him. His own surrender after the attack removed nearly all ambiguity. But the emotional weight of the trial extended far beyond proving who committed the shooting. The courtroom became a space where survivors finally confronted the human being behind the gunfire. And for many, that confrontation brought no clarity at all. Only deeper confusion. How could someone so outwardly ordinary walk into a mosque and slaughter praying strangers? What combination of fear, ideology, loneliness, and hatred creates such violence? Psychiatric evaluations presented during legal proceedings attempted answering some of those questions. Experts described Bissonnette as deeply socially isolated, emotionally fragile, consumed by obsessive political fears and anxiety. Defense attorneys emphasized his mental health struggles, arguing he suffered severe psychological distress leading up to the attack. But prosecutors pushed back firmly against narratives reducing the massacre solely to mental illness. They argued the attack represented deliberate ideological violence. Calculated. Intentional. Driven by anti-Muslim hatred. That distinction mattered enormously to victims' families and Muslim communities across Canada. Framing the shooting purely as the act of a disturbed individual risked ignoring the broader climate of extremism and Islamophobia surrounding the case. The prosecution emphasized preparation, weapon acquisition, research into mass shootings, political fixation. Everything pointed toward conscious decision-making rather than uncontrollable psychosis. Inside the courtroom, survivors listened as attorneys reconstructed the attack minute by minute. Gunfire. Victim positions. Autopsy findings. Escape attempts. Every horrifying detail dragged back into public view. Some family members cried quietly while hearing descriptions of final moments. Others sat rigidly still, hands clenched tightly in their laps. Trauma changes people physically. It settles into posture, breathing, facial expression. Many relatives looked emotionally exhausted long before proceedings ended each day. Victim impact statements became some of the most devastating moments of the trial. Family members stood before the court describing lives shattered permanently by the attack. Wives spoke about children growing up without fathers. Friends described the victims not as statistics, but as gentle, hard-working men who had believed Canada offered safety and belonging. One after another, stories emerged revealing the ordinary humanity behind the 6 names. A father helping children with homework. A husband calling home after work. A professor admired by students. A grocery store owner known for kindness. The courtroom heard about birthdays missed forever. Empty chairs at family dinners. Children asking questions impossible to answer. Some relatives spoke directly toward Bissonnette. Others could not bear looking at him at all. One theme appeared repeatedly throughout the statements. Disbelief. Not simply disbelief that the attack occurred, but disbelief that hatred powerful enough to justify such violence existed within Canada itself. For many immigrant families, the mosque shooting shattered assumptions about safety. Some victims had fled instability or violence in their countries of origin, believing Canada represented peace. The realization that they could still become targets because of religion felt profoundly cruel. Throughout proceedings, Bissonnette remained mostly silent. Observers analyzed his expressions, constantly searching for signs of remorse or emotional reaction. Occasionally he appeared visibly uncomfortable while victim statements were read. At other moments he stared downward silently as evidence unfolded around him. Public opinion regarding him hardened rapidly. To many Canadians, his quiet demeanor made the massacre feel even more disturbing. No explosive fanaticism. No dramatic revolutionary rhetoric. Just a young man shaped by fear and resentment until 6 innocent people died. In March 2018, Bissonnette formally pleaded guilty. The plea eliminated the need for a prolonged trial but did not lessen the emotional burden surrounding sentencing. Instead, attention shifted toward another major legal question. How should Canada punish mass murder motivated by ideological hate? The sentencing hearing became historic because prosecutors sought an exceptionally severe punishment. Under Canadian law, first-degree murder carries automatic life imprisonment. However, courts can impose consecutive parole ineligibility periods for multiple murders, potentially extending imprisonment far beyond the standard 25 years before parole eligibility. Prosecutors argued the scale and brutality of the mosque massacre justified an unprecedented sentence. The defense countered that excessively long parole ineligibility periods violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Beneath the legal arguments existed a deeper philosophical conflict. What does justice look like after ideological mass murder? Can punishment ever feel proportionate to lives erased in under 2 minutes? For survivors and victims' families, no sentence could restore what had been lost. Yet many hoped the court would at least recognize the profound gravity of the attack and the hatred motivating it. During sentencing proceedings, prosecutors described the mosque shooting as a calculated assault not only on individual victims, but on an entire community's sense of safety. They emphasized the vulnerability of the worshippers. Men kneeling in prayer. Unarmed. Defenseless. Targeted specifically because of identity. The defense highlighted Bissonnet's mental health struggles and emotional instability, portraying him as a psychologically broken individual consumed by fear and isolation rather than pure ideological malice. The courtroom listened to competing narratives attempting to explain incomprehensible violence. Monster. Victim of radicalization. Terrorist. Mentally ill loner. Perhaps pieces of all existed simultaneously. Yet none fully explained the bloodshed inside the mosque. In February 2019, the court delivered its sentence. Life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 40 years. The decision marked one of the harshest sentences in Canadian history at the time. Inside the courtroom, reactions varied. Some family members wept quietly. Others remained expressionless. There is no universal emotional response to justice after mass violence. Relief mixes with emptiness. Punishment provides legal closure without truly healing psychological wounds. For Muslim communities across Canada, the sentence carried symbolic importance. It signaled recognition that the attack represented extraordinary violence deserving extraordinary condemnation. But the legal story did not end there. In subsequent years, appellate courts revisited the constitutionality of consecutive parole ineligibility periods. Defense lawyers argued 40 years without parole effectively amounted to a death sentence by incarceration and violated Canadian constitutional protections. The debate became intensely polarizing nationally. Some Canadians believed reducing the sentence would dishonor the victims and minimize the horror of the massacre. Others argued constitutional rights must apply universally, even to those responsible for monstrous crimes. Eventually, Quebec's Court of Appeal reduced Bissonnet's parole ineligibility period from 40 years to 25. The ruling reignited grief and anger among many families and survivors. Some relatives described feeling re-traumatized by the decision. Public debate erupted once again regarding justice, punishment, and constitutional limits. Yet beneath those legal controversies remained a painful truth. No courtroom outcome could erase what happened. The mosque attack permanently altered lives far beyond legal documents or sentencing rulings. Children still grew up without fathers. Survivors still woke from nightmares. Families still visited graves instead of welcoming loved ones home. And perhaps most tragically, the trial exposed how deeply hatred had rooted itself beneath modern political discourse. During proceedings, evidence repeatedly highlighted the role of online extremism, fear-based narratives, and ideological radicalization. The attack did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a culture where Muslims increasingly became political symbols rather than human beings in the eyes of certain vulnerable individuals. Courtrooms can punish actions. They cannot easily repair the conditions that helped create them. After sentencing concluded, many survivors expressed mixed emotions leaving the courthouse. Some felt relief that the legal process was finally ending. Others admitted closure remained impossible. Trauma does not follow judicial timelines. Memories continue long after verdicts. Several survivors later described still hearing phantom echoes of gunfire years afterward. Others remained unable to attend mosque comfortably. One man reportedly sat near exits during every prayer service after the attack because part of him no longer trusted enclosed spaces. The massacre had rewired survival instincts permanently. And at the center of every legal argument, every psychiatric report, every sentencing debate, one devastating image remained impossible to escape. A room filled with worshippers kneeling peacefully in prayer. Then gunfire. Then silence. The courtroom could measure evidence. It could calculate years of imprisonment. It could debate constitutional principles. But it could never fully measure the weight of what those 6 men lost inside the Islamic Cultural Center on January 29, 2017. Nor could it fully measure what Canada lost with them. Long after the court hearings ended, long after the cameras disappeared from outside the mosque, winter still returned to Quebec City exactly the same way. Snow continued falling over Sainte Foy in thick silence. Streetlights still reflected against frozen sidewalks. Cars still struggled through icy roads before sunrise while warm light glowed softly behind apartment windows. To most people, life moved forward. But for the survivors of January 29, 2017, and for the families who lost fathers, husbands, brothers, and friends inside the Islamic Cultural Center, time never fully moved on. Trauma rarely announces itself dramatically years later. Instead, it settles quietly into ordinary moments. A loud sound in a crowded room. A delayed phone call from a loved one. The sight of someone entering a building unexpectedly. For some survivors, prayer itself changed permanently after the attack. Men who once entered mosques with peace now instinctively scanned exits before kneeling. Some sat near doors during worship because survival instincts no longer allowed complete trust in enclosed spaces. Others admitted they struggled hearing footsteps behind them without tension tightening through their bodies. The human nervous system remembers terror long after the conscious mind wants to forget it. And for many Muslim families across Canada, the Quebec mosque shooting altered something deeper than routine. It altered belonging. Before the attack, many immigrants viewed Canada as imperfect but fundamentally safe. A country where differences could coexist peacefully despite political disagreements or cultural tension. The massacre shattered part of that belief. It forced people to confront a reality they had hoped existed elsewhere. Hatred lived here too. Not abstract hatred hidden online alone. Real hatred. Armed hatred. Hatred capable of walking into a house of worship and firing into a crowd of praying strangers. In the years following the attack, memorial ceremonies became annual rituals across Quebec City. Candles flickered beneath winter skies while families gathered carrying photographs of the victims. Politicians delivered speeches about unity, tolerance, and resilience. Community leaders spoke about grief and healing. Yet beneath those ceremonies lingered unresolved pain. Because healing does not move at the pace public attention expects. The news cycle eventually ends. Survivors continue waking up afterward. Several people injured in the shooting carried permanent physical damage for years. Surgeries. Chronic pain. Rehabilitation. Some lost mobility entirely. Others appeared physically healed while privately battling severe psychological trauma invisible to outsiders. One survivor later admitted he replayed the attack constantly in his mind, trying to understand why he lived while others died beside him. Survivors' guilt became another wound many carried silently. Why him? Why not me? Questions with no answers repeated endlessly inside exhausted minds. Children of the victims grew older without fathers present for birthdays, graduations, or ordinary family evenings. Some were too young to fully remember the men they lost. Their understanding of tragedy formed gradually through stories, photographs, and the grief visible in surviving relatives. A child asking about his father years later creates a unique kind of heartbreak. Especially when the answer begins with violence. The mosque itself eventually reopened. Fresh carpets replaced bloodstained ones. Damaged walls were repaired. Prayer services resumed. Community gatherings returned. From the outside, the building slowly regained the appearance of normal life. But places remember. Even after renovation, survivors described moments when memories suddenly resurfaced with terrifying clarity. A specific corner of the prayer hall. The sound of shoes near the entrance. Winter darkness outside the windows during evening prayer. Trauma attaches itself to sensory details. And sacred spaces wounded by violence often carry invisible scars forever. Beyond Quebec City, the attack changed national conversations about extremism in Canada. Before 2017, many people associated terrorism primarily with threats originating overseas. The mosque shooting forced the country to confront domestic radicalization, especially from the far right, with new seriousness. Security agencies expanded focus on extremist online networks. Researchers studied algorithm-driven radicalization more aggressively. Public conversations around Islamophobia grew louder, though often divisive. Some Canadians responded with empathy and solidarity. Others retreated deeper into fear and resentment. That contradiction remains one of the most unsettling legacies of the massacre. Even overwhelming tragedy does not automatically create understanding. Sometimes it hardens existing divisions instead. The internet environments that helped shape Alexandra Bissonnette did not disappear after the shooting. If anything, they continued growing. Online spaces fueled by outrage, conspiracy, and dehumanization remained active across social media platforms and political communities worldwide. The Quebec mosque attack became a warning. But warnings only matter if societies choose listening to them. One of the most haunting truths revealed by the case was how ordinary radicalization can appear from the outside. Bissonnette was not leading rallies, not broadcasting threats publicly, not operating from secret compounds. He radicalized quietly through repetition, through isolation, through consuming endless fear-driven narratives until violence began feeling justified inside his own distorted worldview. That reality unsettled experts deeply because it meant extremism no longer required formal organizations alone. It could flourish inside bedrooms, inside comment sections, inside recommendation algorithms designed simply to keep users emotionally engaged. The pathway toward violence often starts with something deceptively small. Resentment, alienation, fear. Then comes reinforcement. More anger, more division, more narratives reducing human beings into enemies. Eventually empathy erodes. And once empathy disappears, violence becomes easier to imagine. The victims of the Quebec mosque shooting were never symbols to the people who loved them. They were fathers returning home from work, friends telling jokes after prayer, men worried about mortgages, children, aging parents overseas. Human beings living ordinary lives. But inside extremist ideology, ordinary humanity gets erased first. That is always the beginning. Not bullets. Not violence. Erasure. The refusal to see others fully as people. Years after the attack, some survivors spoke publicly about refusing to surrender entirely to fear. They continued attending mosque despite anxiety. Continued raising families in Quebec. Continued believing coexistence remained possible even after unimaginable hatred. That resilience carried enormous emotional weight. Not because resilience erases pain, but because it exists despite pain. One community leader later described the choice facing many survivors after the attack. They could isolate themselves behind fear, or they could continue participating in society while demanding recognition of their humanity. Neither path was easy, especially when public discourse around immigration and Islam often remained politically charged. For many Muslims in Canada, the years after the shooting involved navigating both grief and suspicion simultaneously. Community members mourned the victims while also hearing political rhetoric continuing to frame Muslims as outsiders or security concerns. That contradiction exhausted many people. How do you heal in a society where some still debate whether you truly belong? And yet countless acts of solidarity also emerged after the massacre. Non-Muslim neighbors attended vigils. Churches opened doors for interfaith gatherings. Thousands of Canadians donated to victims' families and anti-hate initiatives. Ordinary people stood outside mosques forming protective human chains during prayers in the days following the attack. Those moments mattered too. Because violence often tries accomplishing something larger than death itself. It tries creating fear strong enough to destroy trust between communities. The response afterward determines whether that fear succeeds. In Quebec City, memory became part of the landscape. Every January, snow returns carrying echoes of that night. Memorials appear again. Names are spoken again. Families revisit grief again. Azidine Soufiane. Khaled Belkacemi. Mamadou Tanu Barry. Abubakar Thapti. Ibrahima Barry. Abdelkrim Hussein. 6 men whose lives became permanently linked by hatred they never chose. And perhaps that is the most painful truth of all. The victims spent years building peaceful lives in Canada. The shooter spent years consuming fear about people exactly like them. 2 entirely different visions of society collided inside that mosque. One built around community, prayer, work, and family. The other built around suspicion, resentment, and dehumanization. Only one side arrived carrying weapons. Even now, nearly a decade later, the Quebec City mosque shooting remains more than a historical tragedy. It remains a warning about what happens when fear grows unchecked inside isolated minds and polarized societies. Because extremism rarely begins with violence. It begins with language. With repetition. With turning neighbors into threats. With rewarding outrage until compassion itself starts feeling weak or naive. The attack also exposed the fragility of modern multicultural societies. Coexistence is not automatic. It requires constant effort. Constant recognition of each other's humanity. The moment people begin believing some groups deserve less empathy, violence becomes possible far faster than most societies want admitting. And perhaps that is why the memory of the mosque shooting still feels so heavy years later. Not only because 6 innocent men died, but because their deaths revealed how thin the barrier can be between ordinary life and unimaginable violence. One winter evening. One radicalized mind. 2 minutes of gunfire. And countless lives altered forever. Somewhere in Quebec City tonight, evening prayer will happen again. Worshippers will remove their shoes near the entrance. Coats will hang along walls still warm from winter cold outside. Quiet greetings will pass between friends and families gathering together exactly as human beings always have. Life continues. It always does. But memory continues too. And inside that memory lives both grief and responsibility. The responsibility to recognize hatred before it hardens completely. To resist the temptation of dehumanization even during fear. To remember that the victims inside the mosque were never strangers, invaders, or symbols. They were people. Ordinary people. And on January 29, 2017, they walked into a place of worship believing they were safe. That belief lasted less than 2 minutes. The consequences will last generations. There are crimes that end when the suspect is arrested, and there are crimes that continue long after the handcuffs close. The Quebec City mosque shooting belongs firmly to the second category. Years after Alexandra Bissonnette was taken into custody on that frozen January night, the legal system continued processing appeals, sentencing debates, and constitutional arguments. Newspapers moved on to other stories. Political attention shifted to new crises. Yet inside grieving families and surviving communities, the event remained permanently active, replaying in memory with a clarity time never softened. In courtrooms, lawyers argued about sentencing limits, constitutional protections, and the meaning of proportional punishment. Judges examined legal precedents with careful language shaped to avoid emotion. But for those who lost someone inside the Islamic Cultural Center, justice was never a matter of legal interpretation. It was a matter of absence. A chair left empty at dinner. A voice no longer heard in phone calls. A father who never returned home from prayer. The gap between legal process and human grief became one of the defining tensions of the case. On paper, the system functioned exactly as designed. The accused was identified quickly. Evidence was overwhelming. A guilty plea followed. Sentencing occurred. Appeals were heard. The rule of law remained intact throughout. But the law can only respond to what has already happened. It cannot reverse it. It cannot reach backward into that mosque and pull 6 men out of gunfire. And so the aftermath became something more complicated than justice alone. It became memory management for an entire society. In Quebec City, the mosque itself continued standing in the same location where the attack occurred. Its exterior looked unchanged to passers-by unfamiliar with its history. Snow still gathered along the roofline during winter. Children still walked past nearby streets on their way to school. Life around it resumed its ordinary rhythm. But inside, the building carried a permanent echo. Survivors described moments when silence felt heavier than before, not because anything visible remained, but because memory occupied space the same way physical objects do. Certain corners of the prayer hall never stopped carrying the past. Places where people fell. Where others tried to help. Where panic replaced prayer. Even after renovation, those memories did not leave with the damaged materials that were replaced. Psychologists often describe trauma as something that does not exist only in the mind, but in the body's learned expectations of danger. After the shooting, many survivors found themselves reacting to ordinary stimuli as if they were still inside the mosque that night. Sudden sounds triggered immediate tension. Crowded rooms created discomfort. Doors opening unexpectedly caused instinctive alertness. The body remembers what the mind wishes to forget. For families of the victims, grief unfolded in a different rhythm. It was not only the loss itself, but the continuing absence of shared future moments. Birthdays that would never include a particular voice. Weddings where a seat remained permanently empty. Conversations that would never happen again, no matter how much time passed. Some relatives described feeling as though life split into 2 versions. Before January 29, 2017. And everything after it. In the years following the attack, Canada also changed in quieter ways. Security at places of worship increased. Mosques across the country reviewed safety procedures. Community organizations developed emergency response training. Law enforcement agencies expanded monitoring of extremist content online, particularly focusing on lone actor radicalization patterns. Academic research into online extremism grew significantly after the case, with analysts studying how individuals like Bissonnette could become radicalized without direct organizational ties. The case became a reference point in discussions about algorithm-driven polarization, digital echo chambers, and the psychology of isolation. But even as systems adapted, the deeper societal questions remained unresolved. How do communities prevent hatred from forming inside individuals before it becomes action? How do societies balance free expression with the spread of dehumanizing narratives? And how do people rebuild trust after violence targets them specifically for who they are? There were no simple answers. Only ongoing attempts. Public memory of the Quebec mosque shooting gradually evolved into something larger than the event itself. It became part of a broader national conversation about Islamophobia in Canada, about the visibility of Muslim communities, and about the responsibility of political discourse in shaping perception. For many Muslims in Canada, the attack marked a turning point in awareness. Not because hatred was new, but because its consequences had become undeniable in a deeply personal way. It was no longer an abstract concern discussed in headlines. It was neighbors. Friends. Community members. Men who had been praying side by side with others in complete trust. The 6 victims were often remembered not through the lens of how they died, but through how they lived. A professor who guided students with patience. A businessman who helped newcomers find stability. A government worker known for his kindness. A father who carried responsibility quietly every day. Their identities resisted reduction to a single moment of violence, even as that moment had taken everything from them. In memorial gatherings, Their names were spoken repeatedly, not as statistics but as reminders of presence. Each name carried weight beyond language, anchoring grief to specific human lives rather than abstract numbers. Azzeddine Soufiane, Khaled Belkacemi, Mamadou Tanu Barry, Abubakar Thapti, Ibrahima Barry, Abdelkrim Hussein. Names that now exist simultaneously in memory and in history. The shooter, meanwhile, became part of a different kind of narrative. Legal documents, psychological evaluations, media analysis, and academic studies all attempted to explain him. But explanation and understanding are not the same thing. One describes structure. The other seeks meaning. Even after extensive investigation, a complete answer to why he committed the attack remained elusive in the sense that satisfies human intuition. There were contributing factors: ideological exposure, psychological isolation, online radicalization. But none of these elements alone fully capture the moment when decision became action. That gap between explanation and comprehension is where much of the discomfort surrounding the case still lives. Because if violence can emerge from such familiar ingredients, then the boundary between safety and catastrophe feels less stable than people want believing. Over time, the mosque shooting also became part of how Canada understood itself. A country often associated with multiculturalism and tolerance was forced to confront the reality that those ideals require constant defense, not passive assumption. Communities learned that coexistence is not a fixed achievement but an ongoing practice. It depends on language, political tone, media narratives, and everyday interactions between neighbors who may or may not fully understand one another. And it depends, most importantly, on whether people are willing to recognize shared humanity before differences become barriers. In Quebec City, winter still returns every year with the same quiet persistence. Snow still falls over rooftops. Streets still grow silent at night. But for many, January now carries an additional weight. A date that interrupts the normal flow of seasons with memory that does not fade. Inside that memory, the mosque remains both a place of worship and a place of loss. Both sanctuary and scar. Both continuing life and permanent reminder. The shooting lasted less than 2 minutes. Its consequences extend far beyond that brief span of time. Because what happened inside the Islamic Cultural Center was not only an act of violence. It was a rupture in trust. Between individuals. Between communities. Between the belief that ordinary life is protected from extraordinary hatred. And even though years have passed, that rupture has not fully closed. It is carried now in anniversaries, in caution, in reflection, and in the quiet determination of survivors who continue rebuilding life around something they never asked to survive. The story does not end with sentencing. It does not end with appeals. It does not end with memorials. It continues wherever people choose either to forget what dehumanization can lead to, or to remember it clearly enough to resist it. And in that choice lies the only form of closure this case will ever allow. Not erasure. Not forgetting. But awareness. Because the most important lesson left behind by the Quebec City mosque shooting is not about one man, one weapon, or one night in January. It is about how quickly human beings can be reduced in the mind of another. And how urgently that process must always be interrupted before it becomes irreversible.